Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I woke because Milo was whining at the bedroom window. He was a 9-year-old border collie and almost never whined. He barked at delivery vans, foxes, people closing car doors, and once at a plastic bag stuck in the hedge. That sound was different. It was quiet and steady, like he was trying not to be heard. I looked at the clock. It was 3:38 in the morning. The room had a faint white glow in it. At first, I thought the security light in the garden had come on, but that light was yellow and only reached the bottom of the curtains. This was softer and brighter. Milo stood with his front paws on the low radiator beneath the window. His nose was pressed against the gap between the curtains. His whole body was stiff. I said his name. He looked back at me, then immediately turned toward the glass again. My wife, Rachel, was asleep beside me. She had taken a strong antihistamine before bed because of hay fever, and she didn't move when I sat up. I got out of bed and crossed the room. Milo stepped down from the radiator and backed away. He didn't leave, but he stood near the wardrobe with his head low. I pulled the curtain aside. A soft white glow hung above the rooftops across the street. We lived in a newer housing estate outside Coventry, the kind where every house had the same dark roof tiles and small fenced garden. Our bedroom was at the front, facing a row of semi-detached houses with a narrow green space behind them. The glow was just above those roofs. I couldn't see a clear object. It looked like a wide patch of pale light, maybe the size of 2 houses side by side. The edges were blurred and the center was brighter without being harsh. It didn't light the street below. That was the first thing that bothered me. The cars, pavements, hedges, and front gardens all looked dark. The glow seemed bright enough to cast shadows, but it didn't. I opened the window a few inches. The air was cool and damp. It had rained before midnight, and I could smell wet grass and concrete. There was no sound from the glow. No engine, no electrical buzz, no helicopter blades. The estate was unusually quiet too. Normally there was traffic from the dual carriageway, even in the middle of the night. I couldn't hear any. Milo whined again. The glow moved. It drifted slowly upward, though it was hard to tell whether it was actually rising or the clouds behind it were moving down. A low bank of gray cloud crossed the sky from the west. The white patch reached the cloud layer and disappeared behind it. The room went dark. Milo stepped away from the window and went into the hall. I stood there for a while, expecting the glow to come back through the clouds. It didn't. I checked my phone. The weather app showed low cloud and light rain. I wondered if I had seen reflected light from a construction site or a football ground, but there was nothing like that behind the houses. Beyond them were fields, a bypass, and a distribution center about 3 miles away. I closed the window. That was when I noticed every car alarm light on the street was blinking together. The small red lights inside the parked cars flashed once. Then again. They were perfectly in time. There were at least 8 cars visible from the window, different makes and ages. All the lights blinked in the same rhythm, 3 quick flashes, a pause, 3 quick flashes. Then they stopped. I woke Rachel. She was groggy and annoyed. I told her there had been a strange light over the houses. She asked if it was lightning. I said no. She looked out the window, saw nothing, and went back to bed. Milo would not come into the bedroom. He lay at the top of the stairs with his body facing the front door. I checked the downstairs rooms. Nothing looked disturbed. The doors were locked. The security light in the garden was off. When I entered the kitchen, the digital clock on the oven showed 3:44. My phone showed 3:51. The oven clock had always been 3 minutes fast, not 7 minutes slow. I checked the microwave. It showed 3:44 too. I stood between them, looking from one display to the other. The refrigerator stopped humming. A faint pressure filled my ears. It felt like being in an aeroplane during descent. I swallowed and moved my jaw, but it didn't clear. From outside came a light tapping sound. It was not at the front door or the kitchen window. It seemed to come from the roof. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps. Milo got up and walked down 2 steps. He did not bark. I switched on the outside lights. The front garden was empty. Rainwater covered the pavement in dark patches. My car was parked in the drive. Rachel's small blue hatchback was behind it. Something pale reflected in the roof of my car. I leaned closer to the window. The sky was dark above the house. The glow had gone. The pale reflection remained. It looked like a long white shape stretched across the black paint, too straight to be cloud. I opened the front door. Milo made a low sound behind me, almost a growl, but he did not follow. The air outside felt colder than it had through the bedroom window. The pressure in my ears grew stronger. I stepped onto the drive. The reflection on the car roof disappeared. I looked up. Nothing but low cloud. The streetlight at the end of the road flickered once. Then the next one flickered. Then the one nearest our house. The pattern moved toward me, even though all the lights stayed on. A smell drifted through the air. It was faint and metallic, like wet coins. I walked to the pavement. Across the street, a curtain moved in the upstairs window of number 14. Our neighbor, Simon Pritchard, lived there with his wife and teenage son. The room was their spare bedroom, and they usually kept the curtains closed. The fabric shifted again. Someone stood behind it. I could only see a dark shape through the gap, narrow and upright. I raised a hand. The shape did not move. Then Simon's porch light came on. The figure behind the curtain disappeared. A few seconds later, Simon opened his front door wearing jogging bottoms and an old football shirt. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I said I had heard tapping on the roof. He shook his head. It was in the loft. He said it sounded like someone walking slowly from one end of the house to the other. His wife had slept through it, but the noise woke him. I asked if he had seen the light. He looked toward the rooftops. "What light?" I described it. He said he had noticed the bedroom getting brighter, but he thought a car had turned around outside. While we were talking, Milo began scratching at our closed front door. Simon looked at it. "Dog, all right?" I said I didn't know. A low vibration came up through the pavement. It was subtle, but both of us felt it. The water in a shallow puddle beside the curb formed tight circles. The vibration lasted several seconds. Then Simon's car unlocked itself. The indicators flashed. The mirrors folded outward. He took his keys from his pocket and stared at them. My car unlocked too. Then Rachel's. Then every visible car on the street. The sounds came one after another. Clicks, chirps, mirrors moving, interior lights turning on. Simon said, "That's not right." The streetlight above us went out. The others remained on. In the sudden darkness, I saw a pale glow behind the houses again. It was lower now. It shone through the gap between two rooftops across the street, close to the ground behind them. Simon saw it too. "What is that?" I told him I didn't know. We stood in the road looking at it. The glow moved sideways behind the houses. It passed through gaps between chimneys and aerials without changing brightness. For a moment, I thought it was a vehicle driving along the bypass, but it was too high and moved too slowly. A dark shape crossed in front of it. It looked roughly human in height, but much too narrow. I saw it for less than a second between two houses, walking along the far side of the gardens. Then another shape crossed. Then a third. None of them cast shadows in the glow. Simon called his son's name. No one answered. He went back into his house. I hurried home and shut the door. Milo stood in the hall, staring at the ceiling. The tapping came again. This time it moved across the roof from the front of the house toward the back. 3 taps above the bedroom. A pause. 3 taps above the landing. A pause. 3 taps above the kitchen. The sound was too controlled to be rain or branches. We had no trees close enough to touch the roof. I went upstairs and woke Rachel properly. She saw my face and stopped complaining. I told her to get dressed. While she did, I checked our daughter's room. Lucy was away at university, but I still looked inside. The room was empty. Her old digital alarm clock showed 4:03. My phone showed 4:17. The pressure in my ears disappeared suddenly. Every clock in the house changed at once. The alarm clock flickered from 4:03 to 4:17. Downstairs, I heard the oven beep. The heating timer clicked. 14 minutes had passed somewhere. Rachel came into the hall wearing jeans and a jumper. I started telling her about the clocks when Milo barked once. It was sharp and loud after all the quiet whining. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking into the living room. The television had turned on. The screen showed the feed from our doorbell camera. The image was black and white, even though the camera normally showed color at night. Our front garden was visible. The cars sat unlocked in the drive. The street beyond looked empty. In the upper part of the image, a pale shape hung over the opposite roofs. It was clearer on the television than it had been through the window. It looked oval from below, with a darker center and a soft white edge. There were no visible lights or solid details. 3 thin figures stood in the road beneath it. I looked through the living room curtains. The road was empty. On the television, the figures remained. They faced our house. Rachel asked what she was looking at. I said I didn't know. One of the shapes moved toward the camera. It did not walk normally. It seemed to be farther away in one frame and closer in the next, without crossing the space between. The doorbell made a soft chime. No one was visible through the glass beside the door. On the television, the figure stood directly in front of the camera. It was tall enough that only the upper part of its body fit on screen. Its head looked narrow and smooth. I could not make out eyes, but 2 pale spots appeared where they should have been. Milo backed into the kitchen. The doorbell chimed again. Rachel whispered that we should call the police. I tried. The call connected without ringing. A man answered and said, "Emergency." "Which service?" I started giving our address. My own voice came through the phone half a second later, repeating every word. Then another voice joined it. It was low and slow, copying the shape of my speech without forming the same sounds. I ended the call. The television image froze. The figure outside turned its head towards something above the camera. The white glow brightened. All 3 shapes disappeared. The front door handle moved down. It turned slowly and stopped against the lock. Milo began whining again. The handle returned to its normal position. Then someone knocked. 3 times. Not loudly. The same measured taps I had heard on the roof. Rachel and I stood in the hall without moving. A voice came through the door. "Daniel?" It sounded like Simon. I did not answer. "Daniel, open up." The voice was almost right. The tone was his, but the timing between the words was too even. Like separate recordings played one after another. I looked at the television. The doorbell camera showed no one there. Then Simon shouted from across the street, "Dan, don't open it!" The voice at our door stopped. I looked through the upstairs window. Simon stood inside his bedroom, waving at me through the glass. He pointed upward. Above the neighboring rooftops, the pale object rose again. This time I could see a faint dark shape under it. Not figures. Something attached to the glow itself, broad and flat, like the underside of a cloud with straight edges. The object climbed silently toward the low cloud layer. The streetlights dimmed as it passed above them. For a moment, the clouds opened enough to show a darker patch of sky. The pale object moved into it and began fading from the outside inward. Before it disappeared, 3 small points of light showed along one edge. They were not bright. They looked like holes with daylight behind them. Then the clouds closed. The car doors locked all at once. The television returned to a normal channel. The front doorbell camera worked again and showed an empty garden. Milo stopped whining. No one spoke for several minutes. Simon called my phone. This time the call sounded normal. He said there had been something in his loft. He had opened the hatch and shone a torch up there. He saw no one, but the insulation beneath the roof window was wet in a long oval patch. The roof itself was dry. We agreed to stay inside until daylight. Around 5:30, normal traffic noise returned from the bypass. Birds started in the trees. The whole estate seemed to wake at once. At 7, I took Milo outside. He refused to step onto the front drive until I carried him over the threshold. There were no footprints on the wet pavement. Nothing had been damaged. The roof looked normal from the ground. On the front door, just below the handle, 3 small dry marks showed against the morning condensation. They were long and narrow, placed close together. Simon came across with a ladder. We checked my roof and loft. There were no broken tiles, no animals, and no signs anyone had been inside. Above the bedroom window, the insulation was warm. Everything around it was cold. We found a pale oval stain on the wooden roof beam. It looked fresh, but felt completely dry. Simon rubbed it with his thumb, and the mark faded. Rachel went downstairs to make coffee. A few seconds later, she called my name. The oven clock showed 3:38. The microwave showed 3:38. My phone showed 7:26. As we watched, both kitchen clocks changed to the correct time. Milo was standing at the back door. He wasn't looking into the garden. He was looking up at the low gray clouds, quietly whining. The windshield went completely dry while I was driving through the worst rain I had seen all summer. 1 second, the wipers were struggling to keep up. Water covered the glass in moving sheets, and the headlights only showed the next few meters of road. The next second, every drop vanished. The wipers kept moving across dry glass. I heard the rubber blades drag twice before I switched them off. For about 5 seconds, the windscreen stayed perfectly clear. Rain hammered the roof, ran down the side windows, and sprayed across the bonnet, but nothing touched the glass in front of me. That was when I saw the shape overhead. It was faint and triangular, almost the same gray as the clouds. I only saw part of it through the top of the windscreen as it moved over the car from behind. There were no lights that I noticed, no engine sound, no sharp outline. It was just a wide, dark angle sliding silently above the road. Then the rain struck the windshield again. The glass went white with water, the road disappeared, and I hit the wipers at full speed. I slowed to about 20 miles an hour and tried to stay between the lines. I was on Highway 22 west of Salem, Oregon, coming home from a job in Lincoln City. It was around 7 in the evening, but the storm had made it look much later. The road ran through wooded hills there, with long sections between houses and only a few places to pull over. I told myself the dry windshield had been caused by wind pressure. A strong gust could have pushed the rain over the car. The shape might have been a low cloud or a shadow from the trees. That explanation worked for maybe half a minute. Then the radio went quiet. The music did not fade into static. The singer stopped in the middle of a word and the speakers produced a low, steady tone. I changed stations. The tone stayed. I switched the radio off. It continued for another 2 seconds before stopping. My phone was connected to the charger in the cup holder. The screen lit up and showed an incoming call from my wife, Dana. I pressed the answer button on the steering wheel. "Hey," I said. No one replied. I could hear rain through the phone, but it did not match the rain around me. The sound on the call was slower, with individual drops hitting something hollow. "Dana?" There was a faint clicking noise. 3 clicks. A pause. Then 3 more. The call ended. I checked the screen. There was no record of an incoming call. I tried calling Dana back. My phone showed 1 bar of signal, then none. The road curved between 2 steep slopes covered in fir trees. Water rushed along the shoulders, carrying leaves and small branches. I kept both hands on the wheel and watched for standing water. A pair of headlights appeared behind me. They came up quickly, then stopped about 50 yards back. I expected the vehicle to pass, but it stayed there. The lights looked unusually high and far apart, like they belonged to a large truck. I could not see the body behind them because of the rain. I slowed to 15. The lights slowed too. I sped up. They remained the same distance behind me. There was a turnout ahead near an old logging road. I put on my indicator and pulled over, hoping the truck would continue past. The headlights stopped on the road behind me. I sat there with the engine running. Rain shook the car. The side windows were almost impossible to see through, but the rearview mirror showed the 2 lights clearly. They did not move closer. They just remained in the lane, shining through the storm. I pressed the hazard button. The indicators flashed once and stopped. I pressed it again. Nothing happened. The headlights behind me rose, not grew brighter, rose. They lifted slowly above the road while keeping the same distance apart. At first, I thought the vehicle was climbing a hill, but the road behind me was level. The lights moved higher until they were above the tree line. Then they tilted. 1 light shifted slightly forward and the other back, as if both were attached to something turning in the air. I twisted around in my seat. Through the rear window, I saw only blurred white circles in the rain. The windscreen dried again. This time it happened more slowly. The water stopped hitting the center first. A clear area spread outward until the entire windshield was dry from edge to edge. The wipers squealed across it. I shut them off. Rain still streamed down the driver's window. Through the clear glass, I saw the faint triangular silhouette ahead of me. It hung above the road at the level of the tallest trees. I could not tell how far away it was. It seemed huge. but the rain and darkness made distance hard to judge. The shape had a broad front edge and two long sides that narrowed toward a point. Its surface looked uneven, almost like cloud, except it held its shape. The two lights behind me were now underneath it. They moved forward without any sound. I started driving. The tires spun briefly on wet gravel before catching. I pulled back onto the highway and accelerated. The triangle stayed above the road. It did not appear to chase me. It moved at the same slow pace, but somehow it remained ahead. When the road curved, the shape shifted behind the trees and appeared again over the next straight section. The windshield stayed dry for 9 or 10 seconds. Then water hit it all at once. The sudden loss of visibility made me jerk the wheel. The right tires crossed the rumble strip, and I corrected before reaching the ditch. The dashboard clock read 7:18. My phone read 7:07. I checked again, thinking I had looked at it wrong. The car clock still showed 7:18. The phone changed to 7:08. I knew the dashboard clock was accurate. I had set it that morning after replacing the battery. A road sign came up on the right. Salem 28. That made no sense. I had passed a sign saying Salem was 21 miles away just before the storm got heavy. I had been driving east the whole time. I slowed and looked for a place to turn around, then decided not to. Turning back would only take me farther into the hills, and I was sure I was still on the correct road. The high headlights reappeared in my mirror. They were lower now, back at road level. A dark vehicle shape formed around them. It looked like a box truck or large van, but I could not see a grille, windscreen, or marker lights. It stayed behind me without passing. The road began descending. The low tone returned through the speakers, even though the radio was off. I could feel it in the steering wheel. It was not loud, but it made my fingers ache. The dashboard lights dimmed. The speedometer dropped to 0. The car was still moving at around 40, but the needle sat at the bottom. The fuel gauge moved slowly toward empty. The temperature gauge rose. I pressed the accelerator. The engine sounded normal. Ahead, a reflective road sign flashed in my headlights. I expected another distance marker, but there was no writing on it. It was a plain white rectangle fixed to 2 posts. As I passed, I saw 3 dark marks across the surface. They were long and vertical, evenly spaced. I looked in the mirror. The sign was gone. The truck behind me had disappeared too. I kept going. A few minutes later, I saw a small service station on the left. I had driven that route many times and did not remember it being there. The building had 2 fuel pumps under a metal awning and a red open sign in the window. One pickup was parked near the entrance. I turned in. The station lights flickered as I approached. I parked close to the front door and left the engine running. The rain continued, but the area beneath the awning was dry. I ran inside. A man stood behind the counter reading a newspaper. He was probably in his late 50s with gray hair and a green flannel shirt. A name tag on his chest said, Roy. He looked up when I entered. Bad one, he said. I asked where I was. He gave me a strange look and said, Rick Reel. I knew Rick Reel. It was much closer to Salem. If I had reached Rick Reel, I should have passed several junctions and farms. I asked what time it was. Roy checked a clock above the cigarette display. 7:12. My phone showed 7:12. The dashboard clock outside still showed 7:23. I asked if he had seen anything unusual in the sky. He folded the newspaper. What kind of unusual? I told him about the dry windshield and the shape over the highway. He looked toward the front windows. The rain distorted everything outside. My car sat beneath the edge of the awning, its headlights still on. Roy said, sometimes the rain stops under it. I waited for him to explain. He didn't. Under what? I asked. He rubbed one hand over his mouth and said he had probably misunderstood me. Then the lights in the station went out. The red open sign remained on. For a few seconds, it was the only light in the room. Something passed over the roof. I did not hear an engine. I heard the rain stop hitting the metal panels, moving from one end of the building to the other. The silence traveled slowly above us. Roy looked up. The fluorescent lights came back. He walked to the front window and pulled the blind down. I asked if that happened often. No, he said, not often. Outside, my car horn gave one short beep. I went to the door. Roy told me to wait until the rain returned. I looked through the glass. Water still fell beyond the awning, but the roof above the fuel pumps had gone quiet. The parking lot looked washed out and gray. A pale shape stood beside my car. At first, I thought someone had walked out from behind the pumps. The figure was tall and very thin, wearing something light-colored. It faced the driver's door. I could not see a face. I called out through the glass. The figure did not move. Roy came up beside me. He looked through the window and stepped back. "Stay inside," he said. The figure raised one arm and touched the roof of my car. The interior light came on. Then the passenger door opened. I was certain I had locked it. The figure bent slightly, looking into the car. Its movement was slow and stiff, but not mechanical. It reminded me of someone trying not to slip on ice. The low tone began again. This time it came from outside. The glass door vibrated in its frame. Above the awning, the clouds seemed darker in a broad, triangular area. I could only see part of it through the upper section of the window. The dark patch moved across the sky without changing shape. The figure beside my car straightened. For a moment, it turned toward the station. Its head appeared narrow and smooth. I saw no clear eyes or mouth, only two slightly darker areas where a face should have been. Then the rain struck the awning again. The sound returned all at once. The pale figure was gone. My passenger door remained open. Roy locked the front door after I went outside, which did not make me feel better. I ran to the car and checked the passenger seat. It was dry. The floor was dry. Nothing looked disturbed. The seat belt had been pulled across the empty seat and fastened into the buckle. I released it and got in. The service station lights flickered behind me. I drove back onto the highway. The dashboard gauges worked normally again. The clock showed 17:14, matching my phone. I called Dana. She answered immediately. She sounded upset and asked where I had been. I told her I was near Rickreal. She said I'd called her nearly an hour earlier but had not spoken. She heard rain, then a man breathing near the phone. After that, she tried calling me 6 times. My call log showed none of it. I said I was coming home. The rest of the road was familiar. I passed the Polk County Fairgrounds, the grocery store, and the junction toward Dallas. Traffic increased as I got closer to Salem. I kept watching the sky. For several miles, I saw nothing unusual. Then the windshield dried for a third time. It stayed clear, even though rain covered every other window. A pale, triangular shape moved above the houses to my left. It was much higher now and almost transparent. I could see the gray evening sky through it. 3 faint lights marked the corners, though I could not tell whether they were attached to the shape or showing through it. It traveled beside the road for less than a minute. Then the outline faded. The windshield became wet again. I reached home around 8. Dana was waiting in the garage with the door open. I parked inside and shut off the engine. She checked the car while I told her what had happened. There was no damage and no water inside. When she opened the passenger door, she noticed a mark on the roof lining above the seat. It was a damp oval about the size of a dinner plate. The fabric around it was completely dry. I pressed it with a towel, but the moisture did not transfer. The mark felt cold and slightly rough, like frost under cloth. By morning, it was gone. I took the car to a mechanic named Luis Mendoza. He checked the electrical system, the battery, and the dashboard. Everything tested normally. He said the dry windshield might have been caused by airflow during a strong crosswind. I did not mention the shape. A week later, I drove the route again in daylight. I found the turnout where I had stopped. I found the blank road sign too, except it was an ordinary speed limit sign reading 55. I could not find the service station. There was a field where I remembered turning in. No building, no pumps, no paved lot. I checked the map on my phone and searched for businesses nearby. Nothing matched. I pulled over farther down the road and looked through my call history. At 7:12 that night, during the time I had spoken to Roy, my phone showed a completed outgoing call lasting 4 minutes. The number had no name attached. I called it. A man answered after several rings. He did not say hello. I heard heavy rain in the background and a low, steady tone. Then a voice I recognized as Roy's said, "Your glass is clear again." The windshield dried in front of me. Above the field, 3 pale points moved together through the bright afternoon sky. I saw the oval from the kitchen window just after 6 in the morning. The whole south field was white with frost. The grass along the fence, the stubble from the last cut, The hedges, even the tops of the gate posts, were frozen over. It had dropped to about -4 during the night, and the ground looked hard enough to crack under a boot. Right in the middle of the field, maybe 200 yards from the house, there was one dark patch where the frost had melted. It was a clean oval, about 30 feet long and maybe 20 feet wide. At first, I thought a group of deer had bedded down there. We got roe deer coming through from the woods, and they sometimes left flattened places in the grass. But a group large enough to clear that much frost would have left tracks all over the field. I stood at the window with my coffee and tried to trace a route to it. There was nothing. No footprints from the lane, no tire marks, no trail coming out of the hedge. The frost around the oval was smooth and unbroken. My wife, Helen, came into the kitchen while I was still looking. "What is it?" she asked. I pointed. She watched for a few seconds and said, "Was your brother out there?" My brother Martin helped me with fencing and machinery, but he had not been over since the previous afternoon. I told her no. She asked if I had moved one of the feeders. I hadn't. The sheep were in the north pasture, and we hadn't used that field for anything in weeks. I put on my coat and boots. Helen told me to eat first, but I wanted to see it before the sun came up properly. If it was only a warm patch in the ground, it might disappear once the frost started melting. The air was still and dry. My boots made a hard crunching sound across the yard. When I opened the field gate, the metal latch stuck to my glove for a second. I walked along the fence because I didn't want to disturb any tracks. The closer I got to the oval, the stranger it looked. The grass inside it was not flattened. It stood upright, green and wet, while everything around it was white and rigid. The edge was sharp. I knelt beside it and touched the frozen grass outside. It snapped between my fingers. Then I reached into the oval. The grass there was warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than my hand. The soil underneath was soft. When I pressed 2 fingers into it, dark water rose around them. I expected to smell something burned or chemical. There was only wet earth and a faint metallic smell, like an old bucket left in the rain. I walked the full edge without stepping inside. The oval was almost perfect, though one end was slightly narrower than the other. There were no boot prints, hoof marks, wheel ruts, or drag marks. There were no scorch marks either. The grass was healthy. Near the narrow end, I found 3 small holes in the soil. They were arranged in a straight line, each about the width of a pencil and maybe 6 inches apart. I pushed a piece of grass into one. It went down farther than I expected and did not touch the bottom. I took a photo with my phone. The screen flickered as soon as I aimed it at the oval. The camera opened, froze, then closed by itself. I tried again. This time it worked, but the picture came out almost completely white. The frost, field, and sky were all washed together. Only the dark oval remained visible. I took another. The phone saved it, but the oval appeared in a different place, much closer to the hedge. I looked up. It was still in front of me. I put the phone away. A low sound came from somewhere beneath the field. It was very faint, more of a vibration than a noise. I felt it through my boots. It lasted about 5 seconds, stopped, then came again. I thought of the water main running beneath the lane, but there were no pipes under that part of the property. I knew because we had dug drainage trenches there 2 summers earlier. The vibration came a 3rd time. The frost around the oval cracked. A thin line opened along the edge, not in the soil, but in the frost itself. It moved around the shape like a slow ripple. Tiny crystals lifted from the grass and fell back down. Then everything went still. I walked back to the house. Helen could tell from my face that it was not deer. I told her the ground was warm and there were no tracks. She said it could be a spring. There were no known springs in that field, but it was the most sensible explanation we had. I called Martin. He arrived around 7 in his old Land Rover, bringing a soil thermometer and a metal probe. He had been farming nearby longer than I had and knew the land better than anyone. He stood at the gate for a while before going in. "That wasn't there yesterday," he said. I asked if he was sure. He had repaired a broken section of fence on the western side the afternoon before. He said he had walked past that exact area around 3 o'clock. The field had looked normal. We followed our earlier route along the fence. By then the sky was brighter, but the sun had not reached the field. The frost remained solid everywhere except the oval. Martin measured the ground temperature. Outside the patch, the topsoil was -2. Inside, it was 11 degrees. He checked twice. Then he pushed the metal probe down near the center. It slid in easily for nearly 3 feet. When he pulled it out, the lower half was warm and wet. "Could be a water leak," he said. I reminded him there was no line there. He knew that. He was saying it because he wanted something ordinary to work with. We circled the patch again. At the wider end, Martin noticed the grass leaned slightly inward, not flattened, just angled toward the center. He took off one glove and ran his hand over it. The low vibration returned. Martin looked at me. "You feel that?" I nodded. The probe in his hand began to hum. It was a quiet, high sound, like a tuning fork. He dropped it. The sound stopped as soon as it hit the ground. Then we heard a clicking noise. 3 clicks, evenly spaced. They came from somewhere in the field behind us. We turned. Nothing was there. The clicks came again, farther away this time, near the hedge. Martin called out, "Hello." No one answered. A flock of starlings lifted from the trees at the far end of the field. They rose together, turned once, and flew away from the property. None of them made a sound. Martin picked up the probe and said we should leave it alone until the ground warmed. We returned to the house. At 8:30, the oval was still visible. At 10, the frost around it finally began to melt in the sun. By noon, the whole field looked normal. I went back after lunch. The ground inside the oval had cooled, though it was still a few degrees warmer than the rest. The 3 holes had disappeared. I found the place where they had been, but the soil looked smooth and untouched. I marked the edge with small orange flags. That afternoon, I called a drainage contractor named Colin Reeves. He had installed pipework on neighboring farms and had equipment for checking underground leaks. He said he could come the next morning. Around 4, the sheep started acting strangely. They were in the north pasture, separated from the south field by the yard and 2 fences. Normally they gathered near the feed trough before dark. Instead, they stood along the far boundary, all facing south. There were 32 of them. Every head pointed toward the oval. I went out and shook a feed bucket. None of them moved. Even Bramble, the oldest ewe, who usually pushed through the others as soon as she heard the bucket, stayed near the fence. Their ears were raised. I followed their line of sight. The marked section of field looked ordinary in the fading light. Then one of the orange flags tipped over. There was no wind. A second flag went down, then a third. They fell one after another, moving around the oval's edge. The sheep backed away from the fence. They did not run. They stepped backward together until they reached the hedge behind them. I called Martin again. He said he would come over after dinner. Helen wanted to bring the sheep into the barn, so we moved them before it got fully dark. They were difficult to handle. Several refused to pass the opening that gave them a view of the south field. We had to cover part of the gate with a sheet of plywood to get them through. At 7:15, the power went out. Thus, the lights did not flicker first. Everything just stopped. The refrigerator, boiler, yard lamps, all of it. I checked the fuse box. Nothing had tripped. The houses across the valley still had lights, so it wasn't a local outage. My phone showed no signal. Helen's phone showed the time as 7:11. Mine showed 7:19. Neither clock changed for several minutes. We stood in the kitchen with 2 torches and listened to the quiet house. From the barn, the sheep began stamping, not bleating, just stamping their feet in a slow, steady rhythm. Martin's headlights appeared on the lane. They stopped before reaching the gate. A minute passed, then another. I went outside with a torch. His Land Rover was parked halfway up the lane with the engine running. Both front doors were open. "Martin?" I shouted. No answer. I walked toward the vehicle. The frost had started forming again, thin and white along the grass. Near the Land Rover, I saw Martin standing beside the hedge. He was looking toward the south field. I asked why he had left the doors open. He raised one hand without turning around. "Listen," he said. At first I heard only the engine, then I noticed a low tone coming from the field. It was steady now, not pulsing. It sounded like something large idling a long way away, but there was no direction to it. The sound seemed to come through the ground and the air at the same time. We walked to the field gate. The frost had returned everywhere. The oval was dark again. A pale light hung above it. It was faint enough that I could see the stars through it. The shape was not clear. Sometimes it looked round, sometimes it seemed wider, almost like a flat patch of mist suspended about 20 feet above the grass. There was no beam shining down. The ground beneath it was simply dark and wet. Martin whispered, "That wasn't there when I pulled in." The pale area moved slightly, not across the field. It seemed to turn in place. The stars behind it bent and shifted as though seen through thick glass. I took one step forward. The light above the oval dimmed. Something moved near the ground beneath it. I could not make out a body or clear outline. I saw two narrow dark shapes, then three, all upright and close together. They appeared only when I looked slightly to the side. When I focused directly on them, there was just the field. The barn went silent. The stamping stopped all at once. Behind us, the Land Rover's engine died. Its headlights stayed on. Martin tried his phone. The screen showed a full battery but would not unlock. Mine displayed the camera app, even though I had not opened it. On the screen, the field was brighter than it looked with my eyes. The pale object above the oval appeared as a solid white shape. It was long and smooth, with one end narrower than the other. It hung at an angle close enough to the ground that it should have cast a shadow. Three dark figures stood beneath it. They were thin and roughly human in height, but their heads looked too small on the screen. Their arms hung close to their sides. I lowered the phone. There was nothing clear in the field. I raised it again. The three shapes remained. One of them was facing us. The phone went black. A series of clicks came from the hedge beside Martin. 3. Pause. 3. Something moved through the branches. The hedge did not shake. The sound traveled inside it from left to right, stopping directly beside the gate. Martin stepped backward. I pointed my torch into the leaves. The beam weakened. It turned from white to a dull yellow, then went out. Helen called my name from the house. Her voice sounded far away. The pale object began to rise. It moved very slowly, straight upward from the field. The low tone deepened. My ears blocked, and I felt pressure across my chest. The frost nearest the oval melted in a widening ring. As the object climbed, the dark shapes below it stayed where they were. For a few seconds, I could see them with my own eyes. They were no more than silhouettes, narrow bodies, straight legs. No clothing details, no faces. One of them lifted an arm. The movement was slow and awkward, like someone raising it underwater. Martin grabbed my sleeve. We backed away from the gate. The pale object faded as it rose, becoming more transparent until it was almost the same color as the night sky. The three figures faded with it. The low sound stopped. Every light in the house came back on. The Land Rover's engine started by itself. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then the sheep began bleating in the barn. We went inside and locked the doors. Martin stayed until almost midnight. None of us returned to the field. The next morning, Colin arrived with his equipment. The frost covered everything except the oval. The orange flags were standing upright again. Colin checked for underground water, gas, and electrical lines. He found nothing. He measured soil temperatures at different depths and said the warmth seemed to come from the top 2 feet, not below. There was no source he could identify. The oval cooled by the afternoon. Within a week, the grass inside it turned pale. It did not die, but it stopped growing. In spring, that section came back shorter than the rest. We stopped using the field at night. A month later, Martin found one of my orange flags in the boot of his Land Rover. It was bent into a curve, almost a perfect half circle. He brought it over and left it on the kitchen table. That evening, frost formed on the windows. On the inside of the glass above the sink, a clear oval appeared where the frost would not settle. It stayed there until morning. I noticed the streetlights because the first one came on while I was walking underneath it. It was a little after 8 in the evening, near the end of August, and I was heading home from the pharmacy where I worked. I lived in a small rented flat in the south end of Dundee, about 20 minutes away on foot. The weather had been warm all day, but a cool wind had started coming in from the river. The sun had not fully set. The sky above the houses was still pale blue with a strip of orange behind the rooftops. The lamp above me clicked and turned on. That was normal enough. The lights often came on early when the weather was dull. Then I looked ahead. Every streetlight along the road was already on. There were 12 or 13 of them in a straight line, stretching down to the bend near Balgay Park. Each one gave off the same weak yellow light. It looked wrong against the bright evening sky. The street behind me was still dark. I stopped and looked back. The lamp I had just passed was the only one on. Beyond it, the rest were off. I stood there for a few seconds, waiting for the others to light up. They didn't. A woman pushing a pram came toward me on the opposite pavement. She didn't seem to notice anything. I nearly asked whether the lights looked odd to her, but I didn't want to sound strange. As she passed, the baby inside the pram started crying. Not loudly. It made one short, frightened sound, then went quiet again. The woman looked down and kept walking. I continued toward home. The next street light made a soft, buzzing sound as I approached. It wasn't the normal electrical hum. It rose and fell slowly, almost like the sound of a distant engine. When I walked under it, the buzzing stopped. The lamp behind me went out. I turned around. The light I had passed first was dark again. The one directly above me remained on. The other lights ahead were still lit. It looked as if the darkness was following behind me. I took out my phone and checked the time. It showed 8:14. The battery was at 63%. I opened the camera and pointed it down the street. On the screen, none of the street lights appeared to be on. I lowered the phone. They were all glowing. I raised it again, dark poles against the sky. I took a photo anyway. The image showed an empty street with every lamp switched off. That was the point when I started feeling uneasy. I told myself the phone camera was adjusting for the bright sky and washing out the lights. That was reasonable. I had seen cameras do stranger things with low light. Still, I put the phone away and walked faster. The road was normally busy at that time. People came home from work. Cars cut through toward Lochee Road. Teenagers usually sat on the low wall outside the corner shop. That evening, there was almost nobody around. A white van was parked half on the pavement near a row of terraced houses. Its side door was open, but no one was near it. A radio played quietly inside. I could hear a football commentator speaking, though the words sounded slowed down and stretched. As I walked past, the radio stopped. The van's interior light came on. I glanced inside. There were no tools or boxes in the back. It was completely empty except for a folding chair facing the open door. I kept going. A dog began barking behind a garden fence. The bark followed me along the fence line, but when I reached the gate, the sound moved ahead of me. I could hear it coming from the next garden, then the one after that. The same dog, the same bark, moving from yard to yard without any break. I crossed to the other side of the road. The street light above me flickered. The light behind me went out. Ahead, all the others stayed on. I tried calling my flatmate, Craig, but the call would not connect. The screen showed full signal, yet there was no ringing tone. After about 10 seconds, the call ended. A voicemail notification appeared immediately. It was from my own number. I opened it. There was no voice, only a low, rushing sound. After several seconds, I heard footsteps. They matched mine. I stopped walking. The footsteps in the recording continued for 4 more steps. Then they stopped too. I deleted the message. My phone vibrated again. The same voicemail reappeared. I switched the phone off and put it in my pocket. The sky had begun to darken, but not naturally. The western side still held color, while the sky above the end of the street looked flat and gray. There was no cloud line. It was like someone had lowered a sheet of dull glass over that part of the evening. The street lights beneath it looked brighter. I could see something pale near the last one. At first, I thought it was a plastic bag caught in the branches of a tree. It hovered just above the pavement at the far end of the road, moving slightly from side to side. It was too large for a bag. From where I stood, it looked about the size of a small car. The shape was smooth and pale with no clear edges. It seemed oval when I looked directly at it, but narrow when I saw it from the corner of my eye. A cyclist came out of a side street between me and the object. He was wearing a red jacket and had a bright light fixed to his handlebars. He crossed the road without slowing and disappeared behind a row of parked cars. I waited for him to come out the other side. He didn't. I walked another few yards and looked between the cars. The cyclist was gone. There was no open gate, no alley, and nowhere he could have turned. The pavement beside the cars was empty. His bicycle light was still visible, though. It lay on the ground near the curb, pointing upward. It blinked twice, then went out. I stopped again. The pale object remained near the end of the street. A man stepped out of one of the houses ahead. I felt relieved to see someone. He wore dark trousers and a light shirt, and he stood on the front step looking up at the sky. I called out to him. He didn't react. I called louder. He slowly turned his head toward me. Even from a distance, something about the movement looked wrong. His shoulders stayed facing the house while his head turned farther than seemed comfortable. Then he went back inside and closed the door. The streetlight outside his house went out. A second later, the light behind me went out too. Only the lamps ahead remained on. I turned around and considered going back to the pharmacy. The road behind me looked much longer than it should have. The row of houses continued into the distance, though I knew the junction was only a few hundred yards away. The single lamp nearest me stood dark. Beyond it, the pavement looked almost black. I decided to keep going toward home. My flat was only 2 streets away from the pale object. The wind stopped. A paper cup rolled across the road, then halted upright in the middle of a painted line. The air smelled faintly metallic. I could hear a low sound now, coming from the direction of the pale shape. It was not loud. It felt more like pressure in my ears than an actual noise. Each time it deepened, the streetlights dimmed slightly. The pale object began to rise. It moved slowly and silently above the end of the street. There was no wobble and no visible means of support. It didn't behave like a balloon. It climbed in a straight line, passing the height of the rooftops. As it rose, I saw that it was not reflecting the sunset. Its surface looked white on every side, even when it passed into the darker part of the sky. The nearest windows did not reflect it. I could see the streetlights and the glass, the sky, and the roofs across the road. The pale shape appeared in none of them. I moved beneath the doorway of a closed takeaway and watched. The object reached the height of the church tower at the end of the block. It paused there. The low pressure in my ears became stronger. My teeth hurt. The metal shutter behind me vibrated against my back. Every parked car alarm light began blinking in the same rhythm. Once, pause, twice, pause, once. No alarm sounded. The object tilted slightly. For a moment, I saw something darker underneath it. Not an opening exactly. 3 long marks, evenly spaced, appeared across the lower surface. Then a streetlight burst. There was no loud pop. The glass simply cracked and fell in small pieces onto the pavement. The next lamp did the same, then the next. The brakes moved toward me one by one. I stepped away from the shop and began running. The lamps ahead stayed on. The ones behind shattered in sequence. I heard the light patter of glass hitting the road, but no explosions. I turned onto the street leading to my flat. The lights there were on too. All of them. The pale object moved above the rooftops to my left. It was higher now, but it kept pace with me. I could see it through gaps between buildings. Each time I passed a gap, it was in the same position, hanging at an angle above the roofs. My phone switched on inside my pocket. I heard Craig's voice coming through the speaker. "Ewan?" I pulled the phone out. The screen was black. "Ewan, where are you?" I pressed the side button. Nothing happened. "Don't come up the front stairs," Craig said. His voice was clear, but there was a delay behind it, a second quieter version repeating every word. "Why?" I asked. There was a pause, then his voice said, "You're already here." The call ended. I ran harder. My building was at the end of a narrow street lined with sandstone flats. The front entrance had a blue door and a broken light above it. As I came around the corner, I saw someone standing outside the door. It looked like me. Same dark work trousers, same gray jacket, same black backpack hanging from one shoulder. The person faced the building with its back toward me. I slowed down. It raised one hand and pressed the buzzer for our flat. I heard the buzzer ringing through the open kitchen window above. The figure lowered its arm. I called Craig's name. The person outside the door turned slightly. I only saw part of its face. The skin looked pale, almost colorless, and the features seemed flat, as if viewed through wet glass. The eye on the visible side did not move toward me. The streetlight above us buzzed. The figure stepped away from the door and walked toward the alley beside the building. Its legs moved normally, but its upper body stayed completely still. I did not follow it. I crossed the street and went to the rear entrance instead. The back gate was locked. I climbed over, caught my jacket on the metal, and landed badly on one foot. I ran up the outside stairs and hammered on the kitchen door. Craig opened it. He was holding a kitchen knife. He pulled me inside and locked the door. We stood there trying to talk over each other. He said the buzzer had rung twice. The first time, he had looked through the front window and seen me standing below. He had called my phone because I wasn't answering the intercom. While he was speaking to me, the person outside had looked up at his window. Craig said it had my face. Then the buzzer rang again. We both went quiet. The intercom speaker clicked on by itself. At first, there was only static. Then I heard my own voice. "Let me in." Craig unplugged the intercom from the wall. The voice continued through the dead speaker. "I'm home." The kitchen lights dimmed. Outside, every streetlight on our block went out at once. A pale glow moved across the ceiling. We looked through the window. The white object had risen high above the buildings. It drifted upward without sound, getting smaller and less distinct. The sky around it was almost the same color now. For a few seconds, 3 dark marks were visible inside the white shape. Then it blended into the evening sky. The pressure in my ears released. Traffic noise returned from the main road. Someone shouted from a balcony. A car alarm started 2 streets over. The intercom went silent. Craig and I checked the stairwell and both entrances. No one was there. My phone worked again. The time showed 9:06. I had left work at 8:02. The walk usually took 20 minutes. The next morning, I checked the photo I had taken of the streetlights. The road appeared empty and the lamps looked dark, just as they had on the screen. At the far end of the street, there was a pale shape above the trees. Standing beneath it was a man in a gray jacket with a black backpack. His back was turned toward the camera. I was wearing those clothes when I took the picture. I was photographing the old grain silo outside Redfield when my camera stopped focusing on the sky above it. The silo stood beside an abandoned feed mill, about 3 miles north of town. It was one of those tall concrete ones with a rusted metal cap and faded letters down the side. I had passed it for years on my way to visit my brother, but that afternoon I finally pulled over because the light looked good and I had my camera in the truck. It was early November, cold but clear. The cornfields had already been cut and the ground was covered with broken stalks. There was a steady wind from the northwest, strong enough to move the dry weeds along the ditch. I parked near a chained gate and walked down the gravel access road. The mill had been closed since the late 90s. The windows were boarded up and part of the loading shed had collapsed. There were no trespassing signs on the fence, so I stayed outside and used a long lens. I took a few pictures of the building, the railway siding, and the silo against the sky. The first strange thing happened when I tried to frame the top of the silo. The autofocus hunted back and forth. That happens sometimes when there wasn't enough contrast, especially with a plain sky, so I aimed at the concrete edge. The lens moved in and out, clicked once, then gave up. I switched to a wider focus area. Same thing. The camera focused perfectly on the rusted ladder, the faded lettering, and the weeds at the base. But whenever the focus box touched a section of sky just above the metal cap, the image went soft. I lowered the camera and looked up. There was nothing there. The sky was pale blue with a few thin clouds far to the east. No birds, no aircraft, no power lines. I raised the camera again. The same patch blurred. It wasn't just slightly out of focus. The area above the silo looked smeared, almost like heat distortion over a road, except it was cold and windy. The blur stayed in one place while the clouds moved behind it. I took 3 pictures. The camera saved 2. The third gave me an error message saying the file could not be written. I checked the memory card. It had plenty of space. I opened the first image on the rear screen. The silo was sharp. The sky looked normal. The second image had a pale gray band above the roof, maybe 6 feet wide in relation to the silo. It looked like a thin cloud, but I had not seen it with my eyes. I zoomed in. The gray area was made up of vertical lines. They were very faint and evenly spaced, like scratches on film. I wiped the lens and took another picture. The camera refused to focus. I switched to manual. Through the viewfinder, the top of the silo looked clear until I turned the focus ring toward infinity. Then the sky above it seemed to bend inward. The metal cap looked stretched at the edges, as if I were viewing it through curved glass. When I lowered the camera, everything looked normal again. I thought the lens had developed a fault. It was a used 700mm lens I had bought from a wedding photographer in Sioux Falls, and it had been dropped before I owned it. Maybe an internal element had shifted. I changed lenses and put on a basic 50mm. The problem stayed. That was when I started feeling uncomfortable. I moved 50 yards along the fence to change the angle. From there, the silo stood partly behind the old loading shed. The camera focused normally on the entire scene. I walked back to my original position. The blur returned. It seemed connected to one exact part of the sky, not the silo itself. I marked the place where I was standing by setting my camera bag beside a white stone. Then I walked in a wide circle around the property, stopping every 20 or 30 yards. From the west side, the blur appeared above the silo. From the south side, it appeared slightly to the right. From the east side, it was lower, overlapping the metal cap. Whatever was causing it seemed to be suspended over the building. I still could not see anything with my own eyes. A pickup came down the county road and slowed when the driver saw me. It was an older, red Ford with a snowplow mount on the front. The driver rolled down his window. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s, wearing a tan cap. He asked if I was having car trouble. I told him I was taking pictures. He looked toward the mill. Of what? The silo. He stared at it for a moment. Then he asked, "You getting that shimmer?" The way he said it made me pause. I asked what he meant. He pointed above the silo. "Looks funny through glass sometimes." I asked if he could see anything right then. He leaned across the seat and looked through the passenger window, then rolled it down and looked again. "Not now," he said. I showed him the image with the gray lines. He didn't take the camera from me. He just glanced at the screen and looked away. "You should probably shoot from the road," he said. "I am on the road." He looked at the gate, then back at me. "I mean the main road." Before I could ask more, he drove off. I watched his truck until it disappeared behind a row of cottonwoods. The wind had dropped while we were talking. The weeds along the ditch had stopped moving, but I could still hear wind passing through the dead cornfield behind me. The sound moved across the field without touching anything near the silo. I checked the camera again. The battery had dropped from 74% to 31%. I had charged it that morning. I put in a spare battery. The camera turned on, displayed a full charge, then shut down. I tried again. It worked, but the clock had reset to January 1st, 2000. I had used that camera for 4 years and had never seen it reset. I raised it toward the silo. The viewfinder showed a dark spot in the blurred area. It was small at first, no bigger than a bird at that distance. I assumed that was what it was until it stayed perfectly still for almost a minute. I lowered the camera. Nothing was there. I looked through it again. The dark spot remained. It was not black. It was more of a dull brown-gray with an uneven outline. Each time the autofocus moved, the shape seemed to change size. I switched to video. The camera began recording. On the screen, the object looked wider than it had through the viewfinder. It stretched sideways, becoming a flat oval above the silo. There were no details on it. No lights, windows, or clear surface. Just a darker area that did not match the sky. I lowered the camera while keeping it pointed in the same direction and looked over the top of it. Nothing. On the screen, the shape remained. I moved the camera left and right. The object stayed fixed over the silo. The audio meter began moving even though I could not hear anything unusual. I put one ear close to the camera speaker during playback. There was a low pulsing sound beneath the wind. It came every 7 or 8 seconds. The pulse was followed by a softer noise that sounded like someone breathing out through their nose. I played it again. The second time there was a voice. It was too quiet to understand. I heard 2 or 3 syllables, then the recording ended. The file showed a length of 1 minute and 12 seconds. I had recorded for less than 30 seconds. I looked at my phone. It was 3:46. The last time I had checked, it was 3:18. I had not been there long enough for nearly half an hour to pass. I checked my messages in case I had missed a call. There were none. The phone had no signal. That area usually had weak reception, but not none. I held the phone up and walked toward the road. A single bar appeared, then vanished. Behind me, something struck the metal silo. It sounded like a heavy object hitting the side from inside. The impact echoed through the concrete and rolled out across the empty property. I turned around. Nothing moved. A second impact came from higher up, then a third near the top. They were slow and evenly spaced. I stood by the ditch, listening. The next sound did not come from the silo. It came from the camera hanging around my neck. 3 soft knocks. The body of the camera vibrated against my chest. I took it off and held it at arm's length. The screen was on, even though I had switched it off. It showed a live image of the silo. The dark oval above it was larger now. It filled most of the upper half of the screen. A thin, pale line extended downward from the shape to the metal cap. It looked almost like a reflection, except it stayed perfectly straight despite the movement of my hands. I pointed the camera at the ground. The screen continued showing the silo. I turned around and pointed it toward the road. The live image did not change. I removed the battery. The screen stayed on. That was the moment I decided to leave. I put the camera in the bag without turning it off and walked quickly back to my truck. The gravel crunched under my boots. It was the only sound I could hear. Even the wind in the cornfield had stopped. Halfway to the truck, I noticed someone standing near the old loading shed. It was a man, or at least it had the rough size and shape of one. He stood behind the fence, partly hidden by a leaning wooden post. He wore something light-colored, maybe coveralls or a long coat. His head seemed bare. I called out that I was leaving. The figure did not respond. I kept walking. When I reached the truck, I looked back. The person had moved closer to the gate. I had not heard footsteps. From that distance, I could see that the proportions were wrong. The body looked too narrow, and the arms hung straight down without any bend at the elbows. The head was tilted slightly to one side. I opened the truck door. The interior light did not come on. The key fob would not unlock the passenger side, so I used the key in the driver's door. When I climbed in, the clock on the dash read 12. I turned the ignition. The starter clicked but did not engage. I tried again. Nothing. The figure near the gate stepped onto the gravel access road. It moved slowly, placing one foot directly in front of the other. The upper body stayed still. I locked the doors. The truck started on the third attempt. The radio came on at full volume. There was no station, just a deep pulsing sound like the one in the camera recording. I shut it off and reversed toward the road. The figure stopped beside my camera bag. I had left it near the white stone. I could see the black strap on the gravel between us. The figure bent down. The movement was stiff and careful. Its knees did not seem to bend. It folded forward from the waist until its upper body was almost horizontal. Then it reached toward the bag. I drove away. I turned onto the county road and accelerated hard enough to throw gravel across the ditch. In the mirror, the figure stood upright again. It held the camera bag in one hand. The pale object was now visible above the silo with my own eyes. Only for a second. It looked like a white-gray oval, almost transparent, hanging just above the metal cap. The sky showed through it, but the light bent strangely around the edges. Then it disappeared. The figure beside the road disappeared at the same time. My camera bag lay on the gravel where I had left it. I almost went back for it. Instead, I drove into Redfield and stopped at a petrol station near the highway. There were several cars outside and 2 men filling a horse trailer with fuel. I parked near the entrance and sat there until my hands stopped shaking. My phone regained signal. The time was 4:39. The drive from the mill had taken less than 10 minutes. I had lost almost another hour. I called my wife, Leah, and told her my truck had been acting up. I did not tell her the rest over the phone. She asked if I wanted her to come get me. I said no and drove home. The truck behaved normally the whole way. When I pulled into the driveway, my camera bag was sitting beside the garage door. I stayed in the truck and stared at it. Leah came outside carrying a dish towel. She asked why I had left my equipment on the drive. I asked how long it had been there. She said she had noticed it about 20 minutes earlier when she took the rubbish out. She assumed I had come and left again. The bag was zipped shut. Inside, the camera and both lenses were dry and undamaged. The battery I had removed was back in the camera. The clock showed the correct date and time. Most of the photos from the silo were gone. Only 4 remained. The first showed the building normally. The second showed the gray vertical lines above it. The third showed the dark oval. The fourth was a picture I had not taken. It showed me standing beside the fence with my camera raised. The angle was from high above the silo, looking down toward the road. There was a pale shape in the foreground, so close to the lens that it covered most of the frame. At the bottom of the image, near where I was standing, a second person was visible. It was tall and thin, dressed in something light. It stood directly behind me. I enlarged the image on my computer. The figure had one hand resting on my shoulder. I checked the photograph's timestamp. It had been taken at 4:12. At 4:12, according to my phone history, I had already been driving toward Redfield. The next morning, I noticed a new folder on the memory card. It had no name, only a blank space where the title should have been. Inside it was a single video. The video lasted 4 minutes. For most of it, the camera pointed at the top of the silo. The picture stayed out of focus, and the audio contained the same low pulse. Near the end, the blur cleared. A pale object hung above the metal cap. 3 narrow shapes stood underneath it, balanced on the curved roof. One of them turned toward the camera. The image blurred again. Then my own voice, very close to the microphone, said, "It looked normal from here." I was sitting in my car outside the Kingsley Lake public boat ramp when every warning light on the dashboard came on at once. The engine was off. The key was still in the ignition, but I hadn't turned it. The battery light, oil light, engine light, ABS, tire pressure, seat belt, airbag, even the little blue high beam symbol all lit up together. They stayed on for maybe 2 seconds. Then they went dark. I stared at the dashboard with my hand resting on the key. My car was a 2014 Toyota Corolla, and it had electrical issues before, but nothing like that. A bad battery terminal had once made the clock reset and caused the radio to cut out. This was different. The whole panel had lit up as if the car had started its own test without me doing anything. I turned the key halfway. The dashboard came on normally. The clock read 5:43 in the morning. I was early. I worked maintenance at a private school outside Stark, Florida, and I usually met my supervisor, Dennis Varela, at a gas station before we drove to larger jobs. That morning, Dennis had texted to say he was running late, so I pulled into the boat ramp to wait. It was late September, still hot even before sunrise. The air was damp and a thin mist sat over the lake. There were no boats in the parking lot, no trailers, no fishermen, just my car and an empty pickup parked near the toilets with no one inside. I turned the key back off. That was when I looked through the windshield and saw the white object. It was hanging above the trees on the far side of the lake. At first, I thought it was the moon. It looked pale and round, and the sky behind it was still dark enough for that to make sense. Then I saw the actual moon farther to the right, partly hidden by clouds. The thing over the tree line was lower, much lower. It sat just above the tops of the pines, maybe half a mile away. I couldn't judge its size. It looked about as wide as my thumbnail held at arm's length, but distance made that meaningless. It didn't glow the way a light normally did. There was no glare around it and no reflection on the water. It was simply white, almost flat, with edges that were clear in some places and blurred in others. I rolled down the window. I heard insects, a frog near the water, and the slow creak of a metal sign moving in the breeze. The object made no sound. I watched it for about 30 seconds. It stayed completely still. Then the left side began to fade. Not move. Fade. The white shape became transparent from one side to the other. I could see the dark sky and tree branches through it, as if someone were slowly erasing it. Within 10 seconds, it was gone. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera, but there was nothing left to film. The dashboard lights came on again. This time, the needles moved too. The speedometer climbed to 60 even though the car was parked. The fuel gauge dropped to empty, rose to full, then settled just below half where it had been. The engine temperature needle went all the way into the red. A soft clicking sound came from behind the steering wheel. I pulled the key out. The lights remained on. That frightened me more than the object had. I opened the driver's door and got out. As soon as my feet touched the ground, everything on the dashboard went dark. I stood beside the car with the door open. The interior smelled faintly burned, like overheated plastic. I leaned inside and checked under the steering column. There was no smoke. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Dennis. Running another 20. Meet me at the school instead. I typed back okay, but the message would not send. My signal showed full bars. I tried calling him, and the phone stayed silent for several seconds before the call ended by itself. The clock on the phone read 5:46. Only 3 minutes had passed. It felt longer than that. I walked toward the water. There was a wooden dock beside the ramp, and the mist had gathered around the end of it. The lake was calm, except for small circles where insects touched the surface. Something moved on the opposite shore. I couldn't see it clearly. It looked like a person walking between the trees, except it was too high above the ground. I saw a narrow, dark shape pass behind 2 pine trunks, appear in a gap, then disappear again. I assumed it was a deer. There were plenty of deer around the lake, and in poor light their legs could blend into the background. Then the shape appeared above the brush. It rose slowly until the top of it stood level with the lower branches. It was thin and dark and seemed to lean toward the water. I stepped back from the dock. The mist shifted. For a moment, a straight line formed across the surface of the lake. It ran from the far shore toward the boat ramp, cutting through the fog like a narrow path. The insects stopped. The silence happened so quickly that I noticed it right away. 1 second there were frogs and crickets. The next, there was only the creaking sign behind me. The dark shape across the lake was gone. I returned to the car and shut myself inside. The doors locked normally. I put the key in the ignition but didn't turn it yet. The radio came on. It was tuned to an AM station I never listened to. A man was speaking in a low, calm voice, but the signal was too weak to understand. I caught a few separate words. County, then static, remain, more static, water. I turned the volume knob down. The voice became quieter but didn't disappear completely. Even with the display showing 0, I could hear it under the static. I switched the radio off. The voice continued. I pulled the fuse panel cover off under the dash. I had no idea which fuse controlled the radio, and it was too dark to read the diagram. The voice stopped on its own. Something tapped the roof. 1 tap, then another near the rear window. I looked up, even though there was nothing to see through the ceiling. A 3rd tap came from the boot. It wasn't loud. It sounded like a small branch falling on the car, but there were no trees directly above my parking space. I turned the key. The engine started immediately. Every warning light remained on. I put the car in reverse and checked the mirrors. The empty pickup near the toilets had its headlights on. I hadn't seen them come on. The truck was old, dark green, with a dented rear bumper and a faded sticker on the back window. Both headlights shone toward the lake. I could still see no one in the cab. I backed away from it. As I turned toward the exit, the pickup's reverse lights came on. I stopped. The truck didn't move. Its reverse lights stayed lit for a few seconds, then went out. The headlights remained on. I drove toward the road. The entrance to the boat ramp was only a few hundred feet from where I had parked, but the path seemed wrong. I had entered on a straight paved lane with a brown park sign on the left. Now the lane curved through trees. I slowed down. The road was narrow, with wet grass growing through cracks in the asphalt. Branches hung close to both sides. My headlights showed old tire marks and fallen pine needles. I had been to that ramp many times. There was no curved section. I checked the mirror. The lake was no longer visible behind me. I thought I must have taken a service road by mistake, though I didn't remember turning onto one. The dashboard clock read 5:51. My phone still read 5:46. I reached a fork. The left branch was dirt. The right branch was paved but blocked by a metal gate. Neither one looked familiar. I stopped the car. The warning lights went out one by one. Oil, battery, ABS, engine, airbag. The seatbelt light remained on, even though I was wearing it. Then the passenger seatbelt warning began flashing too. No one was sitting there. The passenger seat cushion slowly sank. It was slight at first, just enough to wrinkle the fabric. Then the whole center pressed downward, as if weight had settled onto it. I grabbed the door handle. Before I could open it, the cushion rose back into place. The passenger seatbelt light stopped flashing. A smell entered the car. It was like wet soil mixed with something metallic. Not blood exactly, more like coins held in a sweaty hand. I turned the air conditioning off. The smell grew stronger. A pale reflection appeared in the passenger side window. I looked straight ahead, watching it from the corner of my eye. It seemed taller than a person and narrow at the shoulders. I could not make out a face. The reflection stayed in the glass even though there was nothing outside except trees. I turned my head. The window showed only my own face and the dark road behind me. The car horn gave a weak beep. Then a bright white light appeared between the trees ahead. It was the same color as the object over the lake. At first it looked like a vehicle approaching through the woods, but there was only one light, and it was several feet above the road. It moved slowly from left to right behind the branches. Every time it passed behind a tree trunk, the light did not disappear. I could still see it through the wood as a dull white patch. I put the car in reverse. The rear-view camera screen came on. Instead of showing the road behind me, it showed the boat ramp parking lot. I saw my car parked in the same space where I had been waiting. The image was grainy and gray like an old security camera. My car was visible from high above. The driver's door was open. A person stood beside it. The figure was bent forward with its upper body inside the car. I looked over my shoulder. There was only the dark lane and the trees. The screen still showed the parking lot. The figure straightened. It was too far away in the image to see details, but it seemed unusually thin. Its arms hung low, nearly to its knees. It turned its head toward the camera. The screen went black. A message appeared. No signal. I took my foot off the brake, and the car rolled backward. The road behind me was straight now. I could see the lake through the trees and the empty pickup near the toilets. I had no idea how I had reached the fork or why it had disappeared. I reversed all the way into the parking lot, then turned toward the real exit. The green pickup was still there with its headlights on. As I passed it, I looked into the cab. The driver's seat was empty. The passenger door stood slightly open. There was mud smeared across the inside of the windshield in 3 long vertical marks. I did not stop. The park entrance appeared exactly where it should have been. Straight road, brown sign, metal rubbish bin on the right. I turned onto County Road 16 and accelerated. My phone connected to the car's Bluetooth. Dennis's voicemail began playing without me touching anything. His voice sounded normal at first. "Hey Caleb, just checking where you're at. I'm heading over now." Then there was a pause. In the background, I heard the same low voice that had come through the radio. It spoke slowly, too quiet to understand. Dennis said, "Hold on, somebody's at the door." The voicemail ended. I called him. He answered after 2 rings. I asked if someone had come to his house. He said no. I told him about the voicemail. Dennis said he had left it about 20 minutes earlier from his truck. He had been alone. I looked at the dashboard clock. It read 6:32. My phone reads 6:31. I had lost more than 40 minutes. I told Dennis I wasn't feeling well and needed to go home. He sounded annoyed but said okay. The sun was coming up by then. Traffic had started on the county road. I passed a school bus, 2 work vans, and a woman jogging with a reflective vest. Normal things helped, but I kept checking the sky above the trees. For several miles I saw nothing. Then a white shape appeared in my rearview mirror. It hung above the road behind me, just over the tree line. The edges faded in and out as I drove. Sometimes it looked round. Other times it looked wide and flat. It never seemed to get closer, but it remained the same size no matter how far I traveled. I turned onto State Road 100. The object followed. I made another turn toward Hampton. It was still there. I considered stopping at a petrol station, but I didn't want to get out of the car. I kept driving until houses became more frequent and the sun was fully above the horizon. The white shape slowly became transparent. This time it faded from the bottom upward. Before it vanished, I saw 3 dark marks inside it, long and upright, spaced evenly apart. Then the sky was empty. I reached home a little after 7. My wife, Lacey, was in the kitchen packing our daughter's lunch. She asked why I was back. I told her the car had electrical problems and I didn't trust it on the road. When I switched off the engine, all the warning lights came on again. Lacey saw them through the kitchen window. She came outside while I was still sitting behind the wheel. The lights went dark before she reached the car. I opened the door and smelled wet soil. The passenger seat was damp, not soaked, just wet in an oval patch where someone's legs might have rested. There were thin lines of mud along the edge of the cushion. Lacey asked what had spilled. I said I didn't know. We checked the floor, the windows, and the roof. Everything else was dry. I left the car in the driveway and went inside. At 8:15, Dennis called again. He said he had arrived at the school and found my toolbox sitting outside the maintenance shed. I told him that was impossible. The toolbox was in my boot. He sent me a picture. It was definitely mine. Same orange handle, same cracked corner, same white paint mark on the lid. I went outside and opened the boot. The toolbox was there too. I called Dennis while looking at it. He opened the box at the school. He described my tools one by one. Adjustable wrench, yellow-handled pliers, tape measure with my initials written on the back. My box contained the same items. Dennis stopped talking. In the quiet, I heard 3 soft taps through the phone. He asked if I had heard them. Before I answered, the dashboard of my locked car lit up. Every warning light came on. Above the houses across the street, something white appeared for less than a second, low enough that the rooflines cut across the bottom of it. Then the dashboard went dark. Dennis said my toolbox at the school was empty. The first thing I noticed was that all 5 callers had stopped transmitting at 2:17 in the morning. I was at the field office outside Missoula going through the overnight data before heading out. We had 19 mule deer collared in the lower Blackfoot drainage, and the software usually showed their movements as a series of dots spaced 15 minutes apart. If a caller missed a transmission, it happened once in a while. Thick timber, a bad angle to the satellite, low battery. That was normal. 5 callers dropping at the same time was not normal. What made it stranger was that they all came back at 2:21, exactly 4 minutes. I checked the raw data because I thought the mapping program had glitched. The timestamps were clean, no delayed uploads, no corrupted packets. Each caller had reported at 2:16, gone silent, then reported again at 2:21. The deer were not in the same herd. 2 were adult does, 1 was a yearling buck, and the other 2 were older bucks that usually stayed several miles apart. According to their last positions, every one of them had been within a few hundred yards of the same clearing. I knew the place. It was an old logging landing about 9 miles up a Forest Service road, surrounded by lodgepole pine and thick regrowth. We called it the Camp 9 clearing because an abandoned crew camp had once stood there. Nothing remained except a rusted stove, a concrete footing, and a flat patch of weeds. I showed the data to my supervisor, Mara Singh. She leaned over my desk and looked at the timestamps twice. Solar interference? She asked. At 2 in the morning? She shrugged. Firmware update? 5 callers from 2 different production batches? Mara straightened up and said we should check the animals. She was practical about everything. If the collars were still working and the deer were moving normally, and then it was probably nothing worth losing sleep over. I drove out around 8. It was early October, cold and wet, with low clouds sitting in the hills. The rain had stopped before sunrise, but water still dripped from the trees. I took one of the department pickups, a white Ford with mud tires and a cracked windshield. The first 6 miles were paved. After that, the road turned to gravel and started climbing. I monitored the collar signals on a handheld receiver while I drove. The 5 deer had moved away from the clearing after the outage. 3 were north of it, 1 had gone uphill to the east, and 1 was still close, maybe half a mile away. Everything looked ordinary until I reached the Camp 9 spur. There was a dead raven in the road. I stopped because I didn't want to drive over it. The bird lay on its back with both wings spread. There were no visible injuries. Its feathers were wet and clean, and its eyes were open. I got out and moved it with a shovel from the truck bed. The body was warm. That wasn't impossible. It could have died minutes earlier. But there were no tire marks, no blood, and no sign that an animal had attacked it. I left it beside the road and kept going. 100 yards farther up, the receiver began making a steady tone. Normally, each collar produced a pulse. The closer I got, the stronger and more frequent the pulse became. This was different. The sound held without interruption, like someone pressing one key on an old phone. I turned the receiver off and back on. The tone returned. I changed frequencies. Same thing. Then it stopped by itself. The The screen showed the battery at 82%, which was what it had shown when I left the office. The compass display, however, pointed south no matter which way I turned. I put the receiver on the passenger seat. The road narrowed as it approached the clearing. Alder branches brushed the sides of the truck. I could see fresh deer tracks in the mud, several sets crossing back and forth. Most were too old to be useful, softened by rain. About 50 yards from the clearing, I found a set that looked recent. The tracks came down the bank from the right, reached the edge of the road, and stopped. There were no prints crossing the gravel, no prints turning back uphill. The last two hoof marks were deep, as if the deer had planted its feet hard. I walked around for several minutes looking for where it had gone. The ground on the other side of the road was soft enough to hold tracks. There was nothing. I took photos, marked the location, and went back to the truck. The engine did not start on the first try. It turned over slowly, then stopped. The dashboard lights dimmed. I tried again, and the engine started normally. The clock had reset to 12. My phone still showed 8:47. I drove into the clearing. At first it looked the same as always. Yellow grass, low brush, black stumps left from logging. The old stove stood near the southern edge, leaning on one side. Mist moved through the trees beyond it. Then I noticed the grass. A section in the middle had been pressed flat. It was roughly circular, maybe 40 feet across, but not perfectly clean around the edges. The grass bent outward from the center in several directions. It looked as if something heavy had rested there, though the ground was not compressed. There were deer tracks all around it, dozens of them. The tracks came from every side of the clearing and ended at the flattened area. Some continued a few feet into it, then stopped. Others turned sharply away before reaching the edge. I parked and got out. The air smelled sharp, like wet stone and burnt dust. There had been no lightning overnight, and nothing in the clearing was scorched. I walked toward the center with my camera. The flattened grass was dry. Everything outside the circle was wet from rain. My boots darkened as I crossed the clearing, but once I stepped onto the pressed area, the soles stopped picking up water. I touched the grass. It felt cold and stiff. There were small gray marks on some of the blades. Not ash exactly, more like a fine metallic powder. When I rubbed it between my fingers, it disappeared and left no residue. I took a sample anyway. Near the middle, I found one of our collar tags. It was not the whole collar. It was the small yellow identification plate that had been riveted to the strap. The number belonged to Deer 32, an adult doe collared the previous spring. The rivet holes were intact. They had not been torn. It looked as if the plate had been removed carefully, even though that should not have been possible without breaking the rivets. The collar was still transmitting from half a mile north. I called Mara. The call connected, but I heard only my own voice coming back with a slight delay. Mara? Mara? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Then another voice came through. It was low and far away. I couldn't make out words, but it sounded like someone speaking from the other end of a long room. I ended the call. My phone showed no service. The forest around the clearing had gone quiet. I could hear water dripping from my jacket and the faint ticking of the truck's cooling engine. Nothing else. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. I walked back to the truck. The passenger door was open. I was sure I had closed it. The handheld receiver lay on the ground beside the front tire. I had left it on the seat. I picked it up. The screen showed 5 caller numbers at once, all on the same frequency. That was impossible. The device could scan, but it could not display multiple signals together. The numbers were the 5 deer that had gone silent overnight. A timer appeared beneath them. It stayed there for a second, then the screen went blank. I put the receiver in the truck and locked both doors. I should have left then. I knew that, but I still had an animal nearby, and there were signs that at least one collar might have been damaged. My job was to check. I took the telemetry antenna and followed the strongest signal north. The woods were dense and wet. Visibility was maybe 30 yards. The ground rose gradually, covered with pine needles and low brush. The signal pulsed normally at first. After 10 minutes, I found more tracks. A single deer had moved through the trees at a walk. The prints were fresh. Water had not collected in them yet. I followed for another 100 yards. The signal stopped, not weakened, stopped. I checked the receiver. The battery read 0. Then it returned to 82%. Ahead of me, something moved between the trunks. I saw the pale side of a deer, then its hind leg. It stood behind a cluster of young pines facing away. I called softly, mostly out of habit. The animal did not move. I stepped to the side for a better view. It was deer 32. I recognized the white ear tag and the dark collar around its neck. The doe stood completely still. Her head was lowered, but she was not feeding. Her nose pointed toward the ground. Rainwater dripped from her back. I watched her for maybe 30 seconds. Then I realized she was not breathing. I moved closer. At about 15 yards, her head lifted. The motion was too slow. It did not look injured or weak. It looked controlled, like the head was being raised by a string. She turned toward me. Her eyes reflected white, even though there was no light behind me. I stopped. The doe's ears stayed pointed backward. Her mouth opened slightly. A clicking sound came from somewhere near her collar. 3 clicks. Pause. 3 clicks. I took 1 step back. The doe stepped sideways into the trees. I expected to hear her run. Instead, there was no sound at all. No branches snapping, no hoofbeats, nothing moving through brush. The signal resumed behind me. I turned. The receiver indicated the deer was back toward the clearing. I stood there trying to decide whether I had followed the wrong animal. It could have been another doe with a dark mark on its neck. The white reflection in the eyes could have come from the sky. The clicking might have been the collar shifting. I returned the way I had come. Halfway back, I found my own boot prints in the mud. There were 2 sets. One led north, the way I had walked. The other ran beside them in the opposite direction. The second set matched my tread exactly. I put my boot next to one. Same size, same worn section along the outer heel. Those prints came from the clearing and headed north, as if I had already walked back before I actually did. I followed them for several yards, then stopped. They continued past me toward the place where I had seen the doe. I left the trail and moved through the brush to avoid stepping on them. When I reached the clearing, the truck's headlights were on. Both doors were still locked. The flattened circle looked darker than before. Mist had settled low over it, but only within the boundary. The rest of the clearing was clear. 5 deer stood at the edge. They were spaced apart around the circle, all facing inward. I recognized 2 by their collars. The others were partly hidden by brush, but I could see dark bands around their necks. None of them reacted when I stepped into the open. The receiver began its steady tone again. The deer raised their heads at the same time. They turned toward me together. I did not move. Their eyes looked black from that distance. Their bodies were rigid. One older buck had its front hoof lifted slightly off the ground, holding it there without shaking. A faint white light appeared in the mist. It was low, perhaps 10 feet above the center of the flattened grass. It did not cast shadows, it just formed slowly like a patch of brightness coming through fog. The deer watched it. The light widened. Something dark stood inside it. I could not see a clear shape. It looked narrow and upright, but it changed when I tried to focus. Sometimes it seemed close, sometimes it seemed far beyond the trees. The receiver display changed, 2:17, then 2:18. The seconds did not move, only the minute changed. I backed toward the truck. The deer remained still. The white light brightened slightly, and a low pressure filled my ears. It felt like driving down a mountain too fast. I swallowed, but the pressure remained. The truck's horn gave one short beat. The deer closest to me stepped forward. Its movements were normal now. It lowered its head and took another step, watching me. The others followed. They did not run. They walked slowly around the edge of the circle, spreading out as if they were trying to come between me and the road. I reached the truck, unlocked it, and got inside. The engine started. The clock showed 2:20. My phone showed 10:03 in the morning. I shifted into reverse. The white light faded. As it disappeared, the dark shape seemed to remain for a second longer. It stood alone in the mist, tall enough that its upper part reached above the deer. Then the clearing was empty. All 5 deer were gone. I drove out without turning around. The road seemed longer on the way back. I passed the dead raven again, but it was standing upright beside the ditch. It watched the truck go by. At the paved highway, my phone regained service. I had 7 missed calls from Mara and 2 from my wife, Tessa. Mara said I had been out of contact for almost 3 hours. I told her I had lost signal in the drainage. She asked why the collars were showing movement at impossible speeds. During the previous hour, all 5 deer had appeared at the clearing, then 12 miles north, then back at the clearing. The positions had updated within seconds. I said the equipment was malfunctioning. That was all I could manage. I drove straight to the office. Mara and our technician Lucas checked the receiver. It worked normally. The timer and multiple collar display were not features the model had. The grass sample contained dirt, plant material, and tiny flakes of aluminium. Lucas said the aluminium probably came from the sample bag or my tools. We found deer 32 that afternoon using a helicopter survey. She was alive and moving with 2 other does about 6 miles from the clearing. Her collar was intact, but the yellow identification plate was missing. The 4-minute gap remained in the database. At 2:17 the next morning, the office server disconnected. It came back at 2:21. When I arrived after sunrise, the 5 collars had uploaded new locations. Every deer was somewhere different, miles apart. For the missing 4 minutes, the map placed all of them inside the parking lot behind our field office. I checked the security cameras. The video froze at 2:17 and resumed at 2:21. In the first frame after it returned, 5 deer stood beside my truck. By the next frame, they were gone. There was a pale mark on the roof of the cab, shaped like a circle. I drove home before dark. Tessa was in the kitchen when I came in. She asked why I had left my field jacket hanging from the back fence. I told her I had been wearing it all day. We went outside together. The jacket on the fence was mine. Same torn cuff, same department patch, same pen in the chest pocket. The jacket I was wearing matched it. Tessa reached toward the one on the fence. Before she touched it, my phone vibrated. The telemetry app had opened by itself. 5 collar numbers appeared on the screen. Below them, a timer began counting down from 4 minutes. I noticed the circle when I opened the garage at 6:10 in the morning. It had rained lightly sometime before dawn, not enough to leave puddles, but the driveway was dark with moisture. The lawn was wet too, and the bottom of my work trousers picked up dew when I crossed the grass to move the recycling bin. Right in the middle of the driveway, there was a perfectly dry circle. It was about 8 feet across, maybe a little more. The edge was clean enough that I could follow it all the way around. Inside the circle, the concrete was pale and dry. Outside it, the driveway was damp. I stood there holding the bin handle, trying to work out what could have caused it. My car had been in the garage all night. Nothing had been parked on the driveway. There were no trees above it, no awning, no basketball hoop, nothing that could have blocked rain or dew. I put the bin down and walked over. The concrete inside the circle felt normal. It wasn't warm. I touched it with the back of my hand, then touched the damp area beside it. The dry part might have felt slightly cooler, but I couldn't be sure. There was no mark or stain, no powder, no smell. The oddest part was the edge. It wasn't fuzzy like a patch that had dried naturally. It looked as if someone had laid a giant round sheet over the driveway during the night and lifted it off just before I came outside. My wife, Erin, had already left for an early shift at the hospital. I took a photo and sent it to her. She replied a few minutes later. "What did you put there?" I told her nothing. She sent back a laughing face and said it was probably from the builders. We had not had builders at the house in almost 3 years. I was running late, so I stopped thinking about it. I backed my car out of the garage, driving across the circle. In the rearview mirror, I saw the tire tracks left dark lines through the dry patch, where water transferred from the damp concrete. By the time I reached the end of the street, the radio cut out. Not completely. The station faded into a weak hiss, then came back, then faded again. I was listening to a local breakfast show, and the presenter's voice kept stretching and slowing down for half a second at a time. I changed stations. They all did the same thing. My phone was connected through Bluetooth, so I switched to music stored on the phone. That worked normally. I lived in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. The drive to the printing warehouse took about 25 minutes, most of it along Broad Street. There were always delivery trucks, school buses, people waiting at traffic lights. Nothing about the morning felt unusual once I left the neighborhood. At work, I showed the photo to my supervisor, Ben Crawford. He said it looked like a trampoline had been sitting there. I told him I didn't own a trampoline. He zoomed in and asked if I had edited it. I told him no. One of the press operators, Darnell, looked over Ben's shoulder and said it might have been heat from something underground. He asked if the sewer line ran beneath the driveway. That explanation sounded possible, and I felt relieved to have one. At lunch, I searched for underground pipes causing dry patches in concrete. I found information about hot water lines and heating systems, but our house had neither under the driveway. The water line came in from the street near the front lawn. The sewer line ran under the side yard. I called Erin and asked whether she had noticed anything when she left. She said no. Then she paused and said the garage light had been on. I always turned it off at night. She said she had noticed it through the door window when she went into the garage. The main overhead light was on, but the switch was down. She had flipped it up and down a few times before it shut off. I asked what time that was. She said around 4:50. I asked if she had seen the circle. She said she hadn't turned on the outside light and it had still been dark. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying not to think about it. The warehouse was loud and there were too many people around for anything to feel unsettling. I told myself the concrete had dried unevenly and the garage light had a bad switch. When I got home, the circle was gone. The whole driveway was dry by then. It had been a warm day with sun and a little wind. I parked in the garage and looked over the concrete before closing the door. Nothing stood out. Erin was working until 8, so I had the house to myself. I took the dog, Max, into the backyard and threw a tennis ball for him. Max was a 7-year-old black lab who usually ran until I made him stop. That evening, he brought the ball back twice, then walked to the side gate and stared toward the front of the house. I called him. He didn't move. His ears were raised and his mouth was closed. He wasn't growling. He just stood there, looking at the gate. I walked over and opened it. The narrow path between our house and the fence was empty. The bins were lined up near the garage wall. Our neighbor's air conditioning unit hummed on the other side of the fence. Max took one step through the gate, stopped, and backed away. I walked around to the front by myself. Our neighbor, Martin Keller, was watering 2 hanging baskets on his porch. Martin was retired and spent a lot of time outside. He knew every car on the street and usually noticed when someone had a package delivered. He lifted the hose and said, "Did you see that strange light over your house this morning?" He said it casually, almost like he was asking about the weather. I stopped at the end of my driveway. "What light?" He pointed upward with the hose nozzle. "Before sunrise. White thing. Thought it was a helicopter at first." I asked what time. He said it had been a little after 4. Martin woke early because of a back problem. He said he had gone into his kitchen to make coffee and noticed a pale light coming through the blinds. When he looked outside, there was something bright above our roof. He couldn't tell how high it was. He said it didn't shine like a spotlight. It was more like a large white glow hanging in the air. He watched it for maybe a minute before it faded. "Faded or moved?" I asked. "Faded," he said, like someone turned a dimmer down. I asked if it made any sound. He shook his head. Then he looked at the driveway and said, "That's where it was lined up, actually." He pointed to the center. I didn't tell him about the circle right away. I asked if he had taken a photo. He hadn't. His phone had been charging upstairs. I showed him my picture. Martin stared at it longer than I expected. He brought the phone close to his face and zoomed in on the edge of the dry patch. "That was there this morning?" I nodded. He gave the phone back without making a joke. We both looked at the driveway. The sun was low behind the houses across the street, and the concrete was evenly lit. A few old oil stains showed near the garage, but there was no sign of the circle. Martin turned off the hose. He said the light might have been from a utility crew using a drone. I said maybe. Neither of us sounded convinced. A car passed slowly behind me. It was a dark blue sedan with tinted windows. I didn't recognize it, but that wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that it stopped at the corner. The car sat there for 10 or 15 seconds with its brake lights on. Then it turned left and disappeared. Martin watched it too. "Looking for an address," he said. I went inside and locked the front door. Max was waiting in the kitchen. He followed me from room to room while I checked the windows. I felt foolish doing it, but the house seemed too quiet. At 7:30, I heated up leftovers. While I was eating, the lights in the kitchen dimmed. They didn't flicker. They slowly dropped to about half brightness, stayed that way for 3 seconds, then returned to normal. The refrigerator stopped humming at the same time. Max raised his head. A low vibration moved through the floor. I felt it more than heard it. The glass of water beside my plate formed small ripples. A spoon near the sink shifted against the counter with a light metallic sound. I stood up. The vibration lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then it stopped, and the refrigerator came back on. I checked outside. No trucks were passing. No heavy equipment was nearby. Martin's porch was empty. The air had gone completely still. A small maple tree in our front yard had been moving in the breeze all evening. Now, every leaf was motionless. I stepped onto the porch. The streetlights had come on. Most of the houses had lights in their front rooms. Someone was mowing a lawn farther down the block, but I couldn't hear the mower. I could see the man pushing it in straight lines across his yard, yet there was no engine noise. I thought my hearing had suddenly gone. I snapped my fingers beside my ear. The sound was clear. The screen door clicked shut behind me. I heard a dog bark inside a house across the street. I heard an airplane somewhere high above, but the mower made no sound. The man reached the end of his yard, turned, and pushed it back the other way. The machine was definitely running. I could see grass clippings coming from the side. Then the sound returned all at once. The mower roared from down the street, much louder than it should have been. I stepped back into the house. Max was standing near the door to the garage. His nose was pressed against the gap at the bottom. I called his name. He looked at me, then back at the door. There was a faint ticking sound on the other side. It came at regular intervals. Tick, pause, tick, pause. I opened the door. The garage was dark except for the yellow light from the kitchen. My car sat where I had parked it. Tools hung on the wall. Boxes were stacked near the freezer. The ticking stopped. I reached for the switch and turned on the overhead light. The bulb came on very slowly. For a moment, the entire garage looked colorless. The red tool cabinet, blue recycling bin, and green garden hose all appeared gray. Then the colors returned. I stepped inside. The concrete floor was dry. In front of the garage door, directly beneath where the car's front end had passed that morning, there were several wet footprints. They were not shoe prints. They looked more like bare feet, except the shape was too narrow and the toes were not clear. Each print was about 10 inches long. The heel area was rounded, then the front tapered into 3 shallow marks. There were 5 prints. They began at the closed garage door and ended beside my car. There were none leading back. I stood near the kitchen door and stared at them. I did not go closer. Max pushed past my leg, saw the prints, and stopped. The hair along his back rose. Then the car alarm chirped once. Not the full alarm, just the sound it made when I locked it. The headlights flashed. My keys were on the kitchen counter. A second later, the interior light came on. Through the windshield, I could see the driver's seat and steering wheel. Nothing was inside. The seat belt on the passenger side began to move. It slid slowly upward along the seat, as if someone had picked it up. The metal buckle rose 6 or 7 inches, hung there, then dropped. I stepped backward into the kitchen and pulled Max with me. I shut the door and locked it. For several minutes, nothing happened. I called Erin. She didn't answer, probably because she was finishing her shift. I called Martin instead. He came over carrying a large flashlight and an old wooden baseball bat. I told him about the footprints. I left out the seatbelt because saying it aloud sounded ridiculous. We opened the garage from the kitchen. The wet prints were gone. Martin walked all around the car. He checked behind the freezer, inside the storage closet, and along the garage door. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. He touched the concrete where I had seen the prints. It was dry. He asked if I was feeling all right. I showed him the photograph of the dry circle again, as if that proved anything. While we stood there, the garage door opener made a clicking sound. The motor did not start. The chain did not move. The little light on the unit blinked 3 times. Martin looked up at it. Then something scraped across the outside of the garage door. It moved slowly from left to right. The sound was low, like a branch dragging across metal. There were no trees close enough to touch the door. Martin raised the bat and reached for the wall button. I told him not to open it. The scraping stopped. We waited. A soft white glow appeared beneath the garage door. It spread evenly along the bottom, brighter in the center. It was not the sharp beam of headlights. There were no shadows from the rubber seal or the cracks in the concrete. The light seemed to come through every small gap at once. Martin leaned closer to the narrow window near the top of the door, but he was too short to see through it. I pulled over a step stool. He climbed up and looked outside. His face changed immediately. "What?" I asked. He didn't answer. He stepped down and handed me the flashlight. I climbed up. At first, I only saw the driveway and part of the street. Then I noticed the circle. The center of the driveway was dry again. The rest of the concrete was dry too, but the circle looked different. It was lighter than the surrounding surface, almost white under the strange glow. Above it, something hung in the air. I could not see a clear object. There was a pale, round area about the width of a small car, maybe 10 feet above the driveway. The edges blurred into the dark. It looked like fog lit from inside, except the night was clear. Within that pale area, 3 darker shapes shifted slowly. They were long and thin. I could not tell whether they were behind the light or inside it. One of them lowered toward the driveway. As it came down, the dry circle darkened around the edge. I climbed off the stool so fast that I nearly fell. Martin asked what I saw. Before I could answer, the garage light went out. The white glow beneath the door became brighter. The opener clicked again. The chain started moving. The garage door lifted 3 inches. Martin grabbed the bottom edge and pulled down. I hit the wall button repeatedly, but it kept rising. The motor sounded strained, like it was fighting against something. The gap reached 6 inches. Cold air came through. A thin shadow crossed the light outside. It paused in the center of the opening. Max barked from the kitchen. The motor stopped. Martin and I held the door down with our weight. For a few seconds, pressure pushed upward against us. It was steady, not jerking or shaking. Then it released. The door slammed closed. The white glow vanished. The garage light came back on. Outside, a car engine started. We looked through the window again. The dark blue sedan was parked across the street. Its headlights were off. I could not see anyone inside. It pulled away slowly, past the front of our house, and turned at the corner without using a signal. The driveway looked normal. Erin arrived home 12 minutes later. Martin stayed until she got there. We told her the garage door had opened by itself and that we thought someone had been outside. She wanted to call the police, but we had no description, no damage, and no license plate. We parked both cars inside and disconnected the garage door opener. That night, Max slept on the floor beside our bed. Around 2:30, I woke up because he was standing at the window. The blinds were closed. A faint white line showed around their edges. I did not get up. The light remained for less than a minute, then faded. In the morning, the driveway was wet with dew. There was no dry circle. I opened the garage door by hand and checked the concrete. Near the center of the driveway, there were 3 small, wet marks arranged in a straight line. Each one was narrow, about the size of a fingertip. Erin came outside behind me. Before either of us said anything, the garage light switched on. I was about 10 minutes past Lafton when I noticed the first mailbox shadow. That road was one I had driven hundreds of times. It ran between low hedges, sheep fields, and in a few old farmhouses before joining the A631 near Gainsborough. I used it whenever I worked late because it was quicker than going through town, and there was hardly any traffic after 9. It was a warm evening in June, close to 10 o'clock, but the sky still held some light. The sun had gone down behind me, off to the west. Everything along the road cast long shadows toward the left shoulder, except one mailbox. It stood outside a stone cottage with a green gate. The box was fixed to a wooden post, and its shadow stretched across the grass toward the road, almost directly west. I noticed because it looked wrong in the same way a picture looked wrong when someone flipped one object but left everything else alone. I drove past and checked the mirror. The mailbox was already too far behind to see clearly. I figured there had been another light source near the house, maybe a security lamp, though I hadn't seen one. A minute later, I passed another mailbox. Its shadow pointed the same wrong way. This one was outside a red brick bungalow. There were no outside lights on, and no cars in the drive. The shadow lay across the gravel in a long, dark strip pointing back toward the setting sun. I slowed down. The hedges, fence posts, and telephone poles all cast shadows east. The mailbox cast west. I remember leaning forward over the steering wheel as if getting closer to the windscreen would help. I was doing about 30 by then. There was nobody behind me, and the road ahead was empty. The next house had two mailboxes mounted together on a metal frame. Both shadows pointed toward the road. That was when I stopped telling myself it was a porch light. I pulled over near a gap in the hedge and sat with the engine running. The car was an old silver Astra. It made a faint ticking sound through the dashboard whenever it idled, and I focused on that for a few seconds. The radio had been playing quietly, but the signal started breaking up. The presenter's voice flattened into a rough hiss, came back for half a sentence, then dropped out again. I switched it off. The evening felt unusually still. No wind moved the hedge beside me. A field of barley stretched away on my right, but none of it stirred. I could see small flies moving in front of the windscreen, so it wasn't like everything had stopped. It was just quiet. I looked back at the nearest mailbox. Its shadow pointed west. I opened the driver's door and put one foot onto the road. The shadow changed, not direction, shape. For a second, it narrowed sharply, becoming much longer than the post itself should have allowed. It reached across the verge and touched the edge of the tarmac. Then it shortened again. I shut the door. I didn't feel frightened yet. Mostly, I felt embarrassed, even though nobody was there to see me. I thought I must have been tired. I had spent 9 hours moving stock around a warehouse, and I'd skipped dinner. Light could do odd things near sunset. Heat above the road could distort shapes. I pulled away. The next few mailboxes did the same thing. Every one of them cast a shadow in the wrong direction. Some leaned across gardens, one climbed partway up a pale garage door, another ran beneath a parked van, even though the shadow from the van itself went the opposite way. It was only the mailboxes, nothing else. I started counting them. 7, 8, 9. At number 10, my headlights came on by themselves. They weren't set to automatic. The switch was on the left side of the dash, and I saw it was still in the off position. Both headlights lit up anyway, bright enough to wash out the road ahead. I turned the switch on and off. Nothing changed. Then the lights went out. The dashboard clock showed 9:58. I checked my phone. It showed 9:55. That bothered me more than the lights. The car clock always ran 2 minutes slow. I had never fixed it because I was used to it. For it to be 3 minutes ahead meant it had gained 5 minutes somehow. I tapped the clock button, but the display stayed the same. A narrow lane came up on my left, marked by a faded sign for North Beck Farm. I knew the road continued straight for another 4 miles, but for some reason, I had the strong feeling I had missed my turn. I nearly took the lane. My hands moved on the wheel before I properly thought about it. The indicator clicked once, then I saw the farm sign and realized I was nowhere near my turn. I corrected and stayed on the main road. As I passed the lane, something knocked softly from inside the boot. It sounded like a plastic bottle rolling against the side panel. I had 2 empty shopping bags and a work jacket back there. Nothing hard enough to knock. A few seconds later, it happened again. 3 taps, evenly spaced. I looked in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. Beyond it, the road behind me looked darker than it should have. I could still see the pale sky above the hedges, but the road itself seemed to disappear about 50 meters back, as though I were being followed by a patch of shadow. I pressed the accelerator. The engine responded normally, but the speedometer stayed at 32. I pressed harder. The engine grew louder. The hedges moved faster beside me. The needle didn't move. Then it jumped straight to 51. At the same moment, every insect mark on the windscreen vanished. There had been dozens of them from summer driving. Specks, smears, one large mark near the passenger side. Suddenly, the glass looked clean. I blinked and leaned closer. The marks returned. I started talking out loud then, just simple things. You're tired. That's all. Get home. Hearing my own voice helped until I realized the inside of the car had become cold. Not cool from air moving through the vents. Cold, like the car had been parked outside in winter. The steering wheel felt chilled under my palms. My breath didn't show, but the side windows began to mist from the edges inward. I turned the heater on full. The fan made noise, but no air came out. The road curved slightly right and opened onto a long stretch with flat fields on both sides. There were no houses there, only drainage ditches and a line of electricity pylons crossing far ahead. That was where I saw the white light. It hovered over a field to my left, maybe half a mile away. At first I thought it was the moon showing through low cloud, except there were no clouds. Then I thought it might be a tractor work lights, but it was too high and too steady. It was faint, not bright. A soft white spot about the apparent size of a street lamp seen from a distance. It hung above the field without lighting the ground beneath it. I kept driving. The light stayed level with the car. It didn't seem to move, but the angle never changed. Trees passed between us, then a low barn, and each time it appeared again in the same place off my left shoulder. I slowed to 20. The light slowed with me. I stopped. The light stopped. The engine continued running, though I could barely hear it. The normal vibration through the seat had gone. The rev counter sat at 900, but the car felt switched off. I looked at the nearest pylon. Its cables sagged between the towers, perfectly still. There was a faint sound outside. It was low and irregular, like someone dragging a wet finger around the rim of a glass, but deeper. I couldn't tell where it came from. It seemed to move from one side of the car to the other without passing through the middle. The white light pulsed once, not brighter, larger. It widened slowly, becoming an oval, then tightened back into a small circle. The mailbox shadows along the road all shifted at the same time. There were 4 mailboxes visible ahead, spaced outside separate properties. Their shadows had been pointing toward me. As the light widened, the shadows stretched sideways across the verges, all in the same direction toward the field. When the light narrowed, the shadows swung back. I watched it happen twice. I reached for my phone to film it. The screen came on, but the camera showed the inside of my car from a viewpoint near the ceiling. I froze. The image showed the top of my head, my shoulders, the steering wheel, and part of the passenger seat. It looked as though the phone were mounted above and behind me. I turned the phone around. There was no second camera lens on that side beyond the normal one. I covered the lens with my thumb. The image stayed visible. I dropped the phone into the passenger footwell. It landed screen up, still showing me from above. In the image, something pale moved across the rear window. I turned around. Nothing was there. When I looked back at the phone, the camera app had closed. My home screen showed 10:17. The car clock showed 10:04. I had been stopped for less than 2 minutes. At least that was how it felt. The white light drifted lower. It didn't descend smoothly. It was in one position, then slightly lower, then lower again, with no visible movement between. Each change happened while I blinked or glanced away. I started driving. The heater suddenly blew hot air into my face. The radio came on at full volume, even though I had switched it off. There was no music or speech, only a repeating burst of static. 4 seconds of noise. 2 seconds of silence. 4 seconds of noise. 2 seconds of silence. I turned the volume knob down. It had no effect. The knocking started again in the boot. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps. The pattern matched the radio. I drove faster. The light remained over the field. I passed a row of cottages, then a small church with a square tower. All the mailbox shadows still leaned toward the white light. Shadows from trees and buildings pointed normally away from the west. The road dipped. For a moment, the field vanished behind a rise. The radio stopped. The knocking stopped. My headlights came on. When I reached the top, the field became visible again. The white light was much closer. It hung just beyond the hedge, perhaps 20 meters from the road. I could not see any solid shape around it. I could see stars above and beside it. The light itself was dull and flat with no glare. It looked less like something shining and more like a white hole cut into the air. There was something beneath it. At first, it seemed like a fence post. Then I realized it stood on the wrong side of the hedge in the field. It was narrow and upright, about the height of a person. I couldn't make out arms, legs, or a face. It was simply a dark vertical shape. When my headlights swept past, it didn't cast a shadow. I kept my eyes on the road. The shape appeared farther ahead. I hadn't seen it move. One moment it was beside the light. The next it stood near a metal gate 50 meters up the road. The gate was closed. The shape was on my side of it. I locked the doors. The central locking made a weak click. As I approached, the shape seemed to flatten. It became thinner until it looked like a dark mark on the air. Then my headlights reached it and showed only the gatepost. I passed without slowing. The white light was now behind me. Every mailbox shadow returned to normal at once. I saw it clearly. There were 3 boxes outside a farmhouse ahead. Their shadows lay across the verge toward the road. As soon as the light slipped behind my left shoulder, all 3 shadows shifted sharply and pointed east, away from the sunset, exactly as they should have. The car clock changed from 10:06 to 10:28. The radio went silent. The cold lifted. The engine vibration returned through the seat. I was doing 68 miles an hour. I braked hard and nearly went into the ditch. The tires scraped over loose gravel before I got the car straight. A blue hatchback came around the next bend, flashed its lights at me, and passed. It was the first other vehicle I had seen since Laughton. I didn't stop again. The rest of the drive took about 20 minutes. Everything looked ordinary. Porch lights were on. A dog barked behind a fence. Someone stood outside a pub smoking. I watched every mailbox I passed, and each shadow pointed in the expected direction. When I reached my street, it was fully dark. My neighbor, Callum Price, was taking his bins out. He lifted a hand as I pulled into the drive. "You're back late," he said. I asked what time it was. He checked his watch and said, 11:15. My phone said 11:16. The car clock said 10:31. I got out and opened the boot. The shopping bags and work jacket were where I had left them. Nothing had spilled or shifted. There were 3 clean dents in the inside panel of the boot lid. They were shallow and round, each about the width of a fingertip. The paint wasn't cracked. The marks looked as though something had pressed outward from inside the metal. I stood there with the boot open until Callum asked if I was all right. I told him something had rolled around during the drive. He looked into the empty boot, then looked at me. I shut it and went inside. The next morning, I drove back the same way with my sister, Hannah. I didn't tell her everything. I only said I had seen a strange light and wanted to find the field. We found the cottages, the church, the farm lane, and the long stretch beneath the pylons. The mailboxes were all there. The field was there. There was no metal gate. The hedge ran unbroken for nearly half a mile. Hannah said I had probably mixed it up with another part of the road. I didn't argue. We pulled over near the place where I thought the light had been. The barley in the field stood waist high and looked undisturbed. There were no tire tracks, no flattened patch, and no equipment. While Hannah walked along the verge, I checked the time. My phone showed 10:42 in the morning. The car clock showed 10:19. It had lost 12 minutes since the night before. I pressed the button to reset it. The display flickered and briefly showed 3 symbols instead of numbers. They looked like narrow vertical lines, each one bent slightly near the top. Then the clock returned to 10:19. From somewhere inside the boot, there were 3 soft taps. I noticed the fish finder had lost the bottom while I was drifting near the eastern side of Lake Ouachita. 1 second, the screen showed 38 feet, a sloping shelf, and a few weak marks close to the bottom. The next second, the depth went blank. The sonar picture froze, then turned into a flat gray band. I tapped the unit with 1 finger. It had done that before when the transducer cable worked loose, so I leaned over and checked the connection beneath the console. Everything felt tight. The screen displayed no signal. I restarted it. The unit came back on, showed the manufacturer logo, then returned to the same blank screen. It was a little after 5 in the afternoon, late September, and I had been fishing alone since lunch. The weather had been warm and still. Thin clouds covered most of the sun, and the water looked dull silver except where the hills reflected along the shoreline. I was about half a mile from a public ramp west of Hot Springs Village. There were 5 or 6 other boats spread across that part of the lake. Most were small bass boats, plus a pontoon near the opposite bank and an older aluminum boat anchored closer to the channel. A man in the nearest bass boat stood up and bent over his console. Then another fisherman did the same thing. The pontoon slowed. I picked up the handheld radio I kept in the storage compartment. Most people used phones, but a few of us still monitored the marine channel in areas where reception dropped out. Before I could say anything, a voice came through. Anybody else lose sonar? It was followed by two people answering at nearly the same time. Yeah. Mine's gone. I pressed the button. Same here. Eastern Basin. A man named Travis Boone replied. I knew him by sight from the ramp. He guided part-time and usually fished from a black and red skeeter. Both units? He asked. I looked toward his boat about 200 yards north of me. Just got one, I said. Both of mine went dead. Another voice said his GPS map still worked, but his depth reading was gone. We compared times. Every unit had lost signal at 5:12. That was strange enough that nobody made the usual jokes about cheap electronics. I checked my phone. It showed 5:13. The boat drifted sideways in the light breeze. I dropped a small sinker over the edge on a marked line and found the bottom at roughly 40 feet, right where it should have been. The lake had not suddenly become too deep for the sonar. A low sound started beneath the boat. It was faint and steady, like an electric motor running underwater. I thought it might be my trolling motor, but the motor was raised. I switched off the main battery anyway. The sound continued. It came through the hull more than the air. I could feel it in the soles of my shoes. The radio crackled. Someone said, "What is that?" Travis answered, "You hearing it too?" The sound lasted maybe 20 seconds and stopped. My fish finder came back immediately. The screen redrew the bottom at 39 feet. A thick red mark appeared halfway down, much stronger than any fish return I had seen. It stretched across the entire width of the display. Then it dropped off the bottom and vanished. I took a photo of the screen with my phone. The picture looked normal, except for a narrow orange line near the top. I hadn't seen that line while taking it. The radio became busy for a minute. People checked batteries, cables, and settings. Nobody found a problem. A man on the pontoon said his phone compass had spun in a full circle. Someone else said his trolling motor had turned itself to the west. After a few minutes, most people went back to fishing. I tried to do the same. I moved closer to a rocky point and cast toward a line of submerged trees. The fish finder worked normally, though the water temperature reading had dropped from 74 degrees to 51. I reached into the lake. The water felt warm. I reset the unit, but the temperature stayed at 51. My line went tight. I lifted the rod, expecting a snag. Something pulled once, slowly, then released. When I reeled in, the plastic worm was gone. The hook had been bent straight. I used 10-pound test and light tackle, so that could have happened with a large catfish or even a submerged branch. Still, there had been no sudden strike. It felt more like someone had taken the line and pulled steadily. I tied on a new hook. The lake had become unusually quiet. There had been cicadas in the woods and the occasional sound of engines in the distance. Now I could hear only water touching the side of my boat. I looked at the other fishermen. Several of them were standing. A man in the aluminium boat pointed toward the southern end of the lake. I followed his arm, but saw nothing at first. Then an orange light appeared above the trees. It was not bright. It looked like a distant aircraft light seen through haze, except it did not blink. The light moved slowly from south to north. It stayed low, maybe a few hundred feet above the water, though judging distance over a lake was difficult. It passed in front of the darker clouds, so I knew it was not a star. I waited for engine noise. There was none. The radio crackled again. "Anybody else seeing that orange thing?" A woman answered from the pontoon. "We see it," Travis said. "Got it." Another man said it looked like a helicopter without running lights. The orange light continued across the lake. It moved smoothly and silently, not fast, but faster than a drifting balloon. It seemed round at first. When it crossed above the open water, it stretched into a short horizontal shape, almost like two lights close together. I took out my phone and started recording. On the screen, the light was much dimmer than it looked with my eyes. Autofocus kept shifting to the hills behind it. I zoomed in, but the image turned grainy. The light stopped. It hung over the center of the lake. The water beneath it darkened. I did not see a beam or reflection. A large patch of water simply became darker than the water around it, as if the cloud shadow above had deepened in one exact place. The dark patch moved against the wind. It came toward us. I lowered my phone. The orange light remained still, but the dark area on the surface traveled north in a slow oval. When it reached the area between my boat and Travis's, the fish finder lost signal again. This time the screen did not show no signal. It displayed a depth of 3 feet. I was still over nearly 40 feet of water. The number changed to 2, then 1. I looked over the side. The water was clear enough to see a few feet down, but all I saw was my own reflection in the gray sky. Something pale passed beneath the boat. It was broad and flat, moving too deep for me to make out clearly. I saw it for maybe 2 seconds through the water beside the stern. It did not look like a fish. The boat lifted slightly, as if I had crossed a small wake. The lake around me was smooth. My depth finder returned to 41 feet. Over the radio, Travis said, "Something just went under me." I picked up the handset. "What did you see?" He paused. "Didn't see it. Boat came up." The man in the aluminium boat said the same thing had happened to him. All 3 boats were separated by several hundred yards. The orange light began moving again. It passed north over the lake, then faded before reaching the far shore. It did not disappear behind the hills. It simply grew dimmer until I could no longer see it. Sound returned gradually. A boat engine started near the ramp. Birds called from the trees. The breeze picked up enough to move the surface. The whole event had lasted maybe 4 minutes. People started talking over the radio at once. The woman on the pontoon said there had been 2 lights, one above the other. Travis said he saw one. A man closer to shore said the light looked triangular. Someone else said it was probably a drone. I wanted the drone explanation to work. There were plenty of large drones now, and some could fly quietly at a distance, but that did not explain the sonar or the pressure under the boats. I decided to head in. I started the outboard and lifted the anchor. The engine sounded normal, but the fuel gauge read empty. I had more than half a tank. I tapped the gauge. The needle did not move. I pointed the boat toward the ramp and kept the speed low. The black and red Skeeter came alongside about 50 yards away. Travis raised one hand. He looked serious. We traveled in the same direction without speaking. About halfway to the ramp, my radio picked up a voice. It was weak and broken. "Stay off the..." Static. Orange. More static. Then my own voice came through. "Something just went under me." I had not said those words. Travis had. I looked toward his boat. He was staring down at his radio too. The message repeated. "Something just went under me." The voice sounded like mine, not his. I switched the radio off. It continued for another second before going silent. The lake ahead looked wrong. The channel markers near the ramp had disappeared. I knew there were 2 green posts and 1 red buoy marking a shallow area, but none were visible. The shoreline also seemed farther away. I checked the GPS. The boat icon sat in the center of the lake, facing south. I was traveling west. The map rotated slowly beneath the icon. Then the screen froze. Travis slowed. I slowed with him. He pointed toward the water between us. Small bubbles were rising in a straight line. They moved from behind our boats toward the ramp, not drifting with the wind. The line was narrow and perfectly steady, as if something were traveling beneath the surface and releasing air at regular intervals. We followed it with our eyes. The bubbles stopped about 100 yards ahead. A soft orange glow appeared underwater. It was faint and diffuse, maybe 10 feet below the surface. It formed a long shape wider than either boat. I turned off the engine. Travis did the same. The glow moved toward us. There was no disturbance on the surface, no wake, no ripples. My radio switched on by itself. The screen remained dark, but a low clicking sound came from the speaker. 3 clicks. A pause. 3 more. The fish finder showed a flat bottom line at 0 feet. The boat rocked once. The orange glow stopped beneath the space between us. I could see something inside it. At first, I thought they were fish. Several thin, dark forms moved through the light. They were upright rather than horizontal, and they stayed evenly spaced. One seemed to tilt toward the surface. I backed away from the side of the boat. Travis shouted something, but his voice sounded muffled even though he was close. The air pressure changed. My ears blocked. The motor's metal casing began to vibrate. The orange light rose until it sat just beneath the surface. For a second, the water above it became completely smooth. The rest of the lake had small waves from the wind, but that oval section looked like flat glass. A dark outline passed under the surface. It had straight edges. I could not see the entire shape, only one long side and a sharp angle at the front. It moved without pushing water aside. Then the light went out. The fish finder returned to 40 feet. The radio clicked off. The channel markers reappeared near the ramp. I looked at my phone. It showed 5:46. The last time I had checked, it was 5:19. Travis started his engine and pointed toward shore. I followed. At the ramp, several people had already pulled their boats out. They stood around the parking lot comparing what they saw. The woman from the pontoon, Marlene Shaw, said the orange light had crossed directly over her boat. Her husband said it had stayed several hundred yards away. They had been standing beside each other the whole time. A younger man named Cody said his watch had stopped for exactly 4 minutes. Another fisherman said his fish finder recorded a depth of negative 12 feet. Nobody agreed on the size or shape of the light. Everyone agreed it made no sound. I loaded my boat and drove home to Benton. My fuel gauge worked normally after I put the boat on the trailer. It showed just over half a tank. At home, my wife, Jenna, was on the porch. She asked why I had not answered my phone. I said I had no signal on the lake. She showed me her call history. I had called her at 5:28 and stayed connected for 2 minutes. She said she heard water and a series of clicks. Near the end, someone whispered her name. I checked my phone. There was no outgoing call. I went inside and transferred the video to my laptop. Most of it showed the lake and a small orange dot above the trees. The image shook because I had been trying to zoom. At the moment the lights stopped, the video froze. The audio continued. I heard radio voices, water against the hull, and my own breathing. Then a second voice spoke close to the microphone. It said, "Lower." The frozen image moved for 1 frame. In that single frame, the orange light was not in the sky. It was reflected in the water beside my boat. 3 narrow, dark shapes stood inside the reflection. The next frame showed the empty lake again. The following morning, I cleaned the boat in the driveway. There was a pale oval mark on the underside of the hull, just behind the console. It was about 4 feet long and perfectly smooth. The aluminum inside the mark felt warm, though the rest of the boat was cold. I called Travis. He had found the same kind of mark beneath his boat. While we were talking, my fish finder turned on in the garage. The transducer was dry and disconnected. The screen showed 40 feet of water. A single orange return moved slowly upward from the bottom. I was sitting on the back steps when every insect in the garden flew toward the same point in the sky. It happened so quickly that I first thought a gust of wind had lifted them. Moths came out of the hedge. Midges rose from above the grass. Beetles, flies, and things I couldn't identify all moved upward at once. They didn't just scatter into the air. They formed a narrow column. The column leaned slightly over the neighbor's field and narrowed toward a point maybe 100 feet above the trees. For 2 or 3 seconds, hundreds of insects seemed to hang there, circling something I couldn't see. Then they exploded in every direction. They hit the house, the fence, the washing line, and the leaves around me. A moth struck my cheek. Several small flies bounced off the kitchen window. Something hard landed in my mug of tea. After that, the garden went completely quiet. I lived outside Market Raisin in Lincolnshire, in a small cottage at the end of a row of 4. Behind the houses were open fields, a drainage ditch, and a narrow strip of trees along an old railway line. It was just after 9 on a warm evening in July. The sun had gone down, but the sky was still light enough to see color. There was no rain, and the air had been still all day. I stood up and looked over the fence. My neighbor, Neil Harcourt, was in his greenhouse tying up tomato plants. He stepped out and looked around. "Did you see that?" I asked. He said, "The flies?" I nodded. He wiped his hands on his shorts and looked toward the trees. We both waited for the insects to start buzzing again. Nothing did. There were usually so many midges above the ditch that walking near it meant waving your arms in front of your face. That evening, the air above it was empty. Neil said they had probably been disturbed by a bat. There were bats around there, but none that could make every insect in 3 gardens fly toward one exact spot. I went back to the steps and picked the beetle out of my tea. It was still alive. It lay on its back in my palm, moving its legs slowly. When I turned it over, it didn't fly away. It walked in a tight circle, stopped, then pointed itself toward the field. I placed it on the wall. It walked straight to the edge and dropped into the grass. My phone rang inside the kitchen. It was my sister, Rebecca, asking about plans for our dad's birthday. I went in and spoke to her for maybe 10 minutes. While we talked, the security light above the back door came on. It was still light outside, and nothing had crossed the sensor. I looked through the window. Neil was standing beside his fence with his head tilted back. I told Rebecca I would call her later and went outside. "What is it?" I asked. He pointed above the field. At first, I couldn't see anything. Then I noticed a small dark patch in the sky. It wasn't cloud. The sky was clear except for a few pale streaks near the horizon. This patch sat much lower and looked slightly darker than the blue around it. It was about the size of a football held at arm's length, though I had no idea how far away it was. Its edges were hard to follow. Each time I focused on one side, the other seemed to blur. "That where they went?" Neil asked. It was directly above the place where the insects had gathered. We watched for a minute. The patch did not move. A passenger plane crossed far behind it, heading east. I could see the aircraft clearly until it reached the dark area. For a second, the plane disappeared. The sound continued. Then it came out the other side. Neil said, "That's cloud then." There was no cloud visible around it. The patch began to fade. It became lighter until it matched the rest of the sky, and I lost sight of it. The insects remained silent. Neil went inside. I stayed out a little longer because the cottage felt hot and stuffy. I switched on the radio in the kitchen and left the window open. A local program was playing music from the 80s. Every few minutes, the signal broke into light static, which wasn't unusual where we lived. At 9:27, the song slowed down. The singer's voice stretched into a deep sound, then stopped. A low tone came through the radio. It was steady and soft, almost below hearing. I felt it more in my chest than my ears. At the same time, the security light went out. I reached through the window and turned off the radio. The tone continued. I unplugged it. The sound lasted another 3 seconds, then stopped. From the field came a faint rustling. It sounded like dry leaves moving, except the trees were still. The rustling grew louder. I walked to the fence. The grass in the field was bending in a narrow line. The movement began near the old railway trees and traveled toward the houses. It looked like something passing through waist-high grass, but the field had been cut a week earlier. The grass was only a few inches tall. The line came closer. Nothing was visible above it. When it reached the drainage ditch, the reeds bent flat one after another. Then the movement stopped directly behind my garden. I stepped away from the fence. Something clicked in the hedge. 3 clicks, with the same gap between them. I thought it might be a bird. Some birds made mechanical sounds, especially at dusk. The clicks came again. This time they were higher, near the top of the hedge. I called Neil's name. His back door opened and he came out holding a torch. "You hear that?" I asked. Before he answered, all the insects returned. They came from everywhere at once. Moths appeared around the security lights. Gnats filled the air over the gardens. Flies landed on the windows and walls. The noise was so sudden and loud that Neil raised both hands to cover his ears. None of them flew normally. They moved in circles around us, all turning in the same direction. Clockwise, the circle tightened. I felt insects striking my arms and neck. Neil swung his torch through them, but they kept moving. Then every insect dropped. They didn't fly away. They fell straight down. The patio, grass, and flower beds were covered with small, dark bodies. For several seconds, nothing moved. Neil whispered, "What the hell?" One moth twitched near my boot. Then another. All across the garden, the insects started moving again. They crawled over the ground in the same direction, toward the field. They climbed the fence. Hundreds of them covered the wooden panels and passed through gaps in the hedge. I could hear them moving through the leaves like light rain. Neil went back to his house to get his phone. Mine was already in my pocket, so I tried to record. The screen showed the garden, but every insect appeared as a white dot. The fence and grass looked normal. The moving dots formed a stream toward the field. I pressed record. The phone shut down. It had been at 60%. Across the field, a light appeared near the trees. It was pale orange and very low at maybe 10 feet above the ground. At first, I thought it was a tractor lamp. Farmers worked late during summer, and equipment sometimes moved along the far track. The light did not cast anything onto the grass. It moved sideways between the trunks without going behind them. I could still see it when a tree should have blocked it. Neil came out again. His phone would not turn on either. The orange light stopped. The insects reached the field and rose from the grass in a dense cloud. They flew directly toward it. The cloud surrounded the light. For a moment, the orange glow took on a clear shape. It looked long and narrow, wider in the center and tapered at both ends. The insects outlined something solid that I could not otherwise see. It was not large, maybe the length of a delivery van. It hung above the ground without sound. Then the insects scattered again. The light vanished. A second later, something moved overhead. We both looked up. There was no visible object, but a dark area crossed the sky above the gardens, blocking the first stars as it passed. It moved from the field toward the houses. The roof tiles made a faint ticking sound. The security lights on all 4 cottages came on together. Neil's greenhouse glass vibrated. Inside my kitchen, every cupboard door opened. I heard them knock against the walls. I went inside. Plates and glasses remained on the shelves. Nothing had fallen. The cupboard doors stood open at the same angle, about halfway. The clock above the cooker showed 9:41. The microwave showed 9:41. My watch showed 9:33. I watched the second hand. It had stopped. Neil called from outside. I went back. He was staring at the upstairs window of the empty cottage next to mine. The owners, Hannah and Mark, were away in Spain. A pale shape stood behind the glass. It was difficult to make out because the room was dark. It looked like a tall person standing several feet back from the window. The head seemed too close to the ceiling. Neil shone his torch at it. The beam weakened before reaching the window. It became a dull yellow patch on the brick and disappeared. The shape behind the glass leaned forward. The movement was slow and smooth. I could not see a face. There was only a pale oval where one should have been. Then the bedroom curtain closed. Neil said we should call the police. My phone still would not start. His displayed a full battery, but every number he dialed turned into zeros. We decided to go to his house and use the landline. As we crossed his patio, something landed on his greenhouse roof. The glass bowed inward without breaking. There was no visible weight on it. The metal frame creaked. A shallow dent moved across the roof from one end to the other, as if something were walking over it with wide, soft steps. Neil opened his back door. The low tone returned. It came from inside his house. His television had switched on. The screen showed gray static, even though he used a digital box. 3 dark vertical shapes appeared in the static. They stood side by side. The center one seemed closer. Neil unplugged the television. The picture stayed on. A voice came from the speakers. It was quiet and broken. I couldn't understand the words, but the rhythm sounded like someone trying to copy speech after hearing it only once. The screen changed. It showed Neil and me standing in his living room. The angle was from outside the back window. We turned toward the glass. The garden was empty. On the television, a pale figure stood behind us. We both moved at the same time. Neil pulled open the front door and we went into the street. The air there felt cooler. Porch lights were on, but no one else had come outside. The road was empty. I could hear a car on the main road and a dog barking several houses away. Normal sounds made it easier to breathe. We walked toward the junction, intending to reach the pub and use a phone. After about 50 yards, Neil stopped. The row of cottages behind us looked farther away than it should have. The road between us and the houses seemed stretched. The streetlights continued into the distance, though there were only 3 along that road. I counted 7. The last one flickered. Under it stood a thin, pale shape. It was too far away to see properly, but it seemed to face us. We kept walking. The pub should have been visible at the junction. Instead, the road continued between dark hedges. Neil said we had taken the wrong turn. There was no other turn to take. A cloud of insects lifted from the hedge beside us. They did not fly toward the sky this time. They formed a flat sheet across the road. The mass was so dense that it looked like dark smoke. Every insect faced the same direction, hovering in place. Behind them, a soft orange light appeared. The insects scattered. The light moved forward. It hung at the height of a person's chest, silent and steady. As it approached, the air around it seemed to bend. The hedges looked slightly curved through the glow. There was something behind it. A narrow, upright shape moved in the darkness, keeping pace with the light. I saw long arms held close to the body and a head tilted to one side. Neil stepped backward. The light stopped. The shape did not. It moved one more step and came partly into view. It was pale gray, not white. Its outline blurred at the edges, like I was looking through rain, even though the air was dry. Its head turned toward Neil. Every insect dropped from the air. The orange light went out. The road returned to normal. The pub sign was visible at the junction less than 100 yards ahead. A car came around the corner and nearly hit us. The driver sounded the horn and shouted through the open window. We moved onto the verge. Neil checked his watch. It showed 10:18. Mine had started again and showed the same time. We had lost about 45 minutes. The pub was still open. The landlord, Keith, let us use the phone. We told him there might be someone inside the empty cottage next to mine. He called the police. 2 officers arrived about 20 minutes later. They checked the cottage with a key provided by Hannah's sister. No one was inside. One upstairs curtain had been pulled shut, though Hannah later said they had left all the curtains open. The officers walked through our gardens and checked the field with torches. They found nothing unusual. By then, the insects were behaving normally again. I stayed at Neil's until almost midnight. When my phone finally restarted, it showed no missed calls and no saved video. I went home after the police left. The cupboard doors in my kitchen were closed. The clock above the cooker showed the correct time. I checked every room before going to bed. Nothing had been moved. The next morning, I found a dark oval on the lawn where the insects had fallen. The grass inside it was covered in fine white threads, each one stretched between blades like tiny pieces of web. There were no spiders. Neil came over and looked at it. As we stood there, the threads lifted together. They rose into the air and pointed toward one place above the field. For a second, they held perfectly still. Then they broke apart and drifted away. My phone vibrated in my pocket. The video from the night before had appeared in my camera folder. It lasted 12 seconds. The first 11 showed white dots moving across my garden. In the final second, the camera tilted upward. A pale shape hung above the rooftops. Around it, thousands of insects formed the outline of a narrow body with 3 long shapes standing beneath it. One of them was looking down at me. The noises started above the guest room at 1:16 in the morning. I was awake because my shoulder had been bothering me, so I had moved to the sofa to keep from waking my wife, Marissa. The television was off and the house was quiet except for the furnace coming on every few minutes. The first sound was a light scrape across the roof. I assumed it was a branch. We lived on the edge of Fort Collins, Colorado, in a newer subdivision that backed up to open land. There were 2 cottonwoods near the rear fence, but neither one reached the house. Still, wind carried all kinds of things around there. I had found tumbleweed caught under the deck and once pulled a plastic pool cover off the chimney. Then I heard 3 slow steps. That was the only way I could describe them. Each sound pressed down against the roof, paused, then moved closer to the front of the house. Not heavy enough to be a person, too heavy to be a bird. I sat up and listened. The steps stopped above the hallway. A few seconds later, something dragged across the shingles. I picked up my phone and opened the security app. We had 4 outdoor cameras. One covered the driveway, one faced the front porch, one was mounted above the back door, and the 4th watched the side gate. There was no camera pointed directly at the roof, but anything climbing up should have crossed at least one of them. All 4 feeds looked normal. The driveway was empty, the porch light was off, the backyard showed a pale strip of frost and the dark outline of the fence. The side gate was closed. I checked the motion history. Every sensor had activated at 1:16. Front porch, driveway, back door, side gate, all at the same second. Each event lasted exactly 11 seconds. I opened the front porch clip first. Nothing moved. The image showed our front steps, part of the lawn, and Marissa's white Subaru in the drive. At the bottom of the screen, the timer counted from 1:16:08 to 1:16:19. No person, no animal, no headlights. The driveway clip was the same. The back camera showed an empty patio. The side gate camera showed the fence and rubbish bins. All 4 cameras had recorded 11 seconds of nothing. I replayed them with the sound turned up. The front camera caught a faint clicking noise. 3 clicks, evenly spaced. The back camera recorded a low hum. The driveway camera picked up breathing. At least that was what it sounded like. A slow intake, then a longer breath out, close to the microphone. I checked the side camera last. For the first 9 seconds, nothing happened. Then the security light above the gate dimmed, even though it was supposed to stay off, unless motion triggered it. A thin shadow moved across the fence. It came from above. The clip ended before the shadow reached the ground. Another scrape moved over the roof. I looked toward the ceiling. Fine dust drifted down from the vent near the stairs. I stood up. The house had an attic, but there was no real room up there, just insulation, ductwork, and a few boxes. The access panel was in the upstairs hallway. I considered waking Marissa. Instead, I checked the doors. The front deadbolt was locked. The back door was locked. The garage entry was locked. I looked through the front window and saw nothing outside. The street was still. It had snowed lightly in the afternoon, then cleared before dark. A thin layer remained on the roofs and lawns. Under the streetlights, the road looked dry and empty. The motion sensors triggered again, all 4 at once. The app showed 4 red alerts, 1:21:42. I opened the live feeds. The front porch image had frozen. The driveway showed the same parked car, but the snow on the lawn was gone. The back camera was nearly black, as though something covered the lens. The side gate feed showed a pale gray sky. That made no sense because the camera was angled downward. I walked closer to the front window. A soft white glow appeared above the houses across the street. It was weak and spread out, like moonlight behind thin cloud, except the moon was on the other side of the house. The glow stayed low over the rooftops and did not brighten the street beneath it. My phone vibrated in my hand. The 4 motion clips ended. 11 seconds again. The feeds returned to normal. The snow reappeared in the driveway image. The back camera cleared. The side camera showed the gate. The white glow outside remained. I woke Marissa. She came downstairs wearing a robe, still half asleep. I told her there was something on the roof and showed her the sensor history. She listened for a minute. Nothing moved above us. She said it was probably a raccoon. We didn't get many raccoons in the neighborhood, but I accepted it because I wanted something ordinary to blame. Then the attic panel shifted. We both heard it. The panel sat in a recessed frame at the top of the stairs. It lifted slightly on one side, dropped, then lifted again. Marissa whispered my name. I told her to stay downstairs. I grabbed the long metal flashlight from the kitchen drawer and climbed the steps. The hallway was colder than the rest of the house. The attic panel looked closed. I stood beneath it and shone the light around the frame. A thin line of moisture had formed along one edge. The ceiling around it was dry. Something clicked above the panel 3 times. I stepped back. The panel rose about half an inch. Cold air came through the gap. Then it settled into place. I went downstairs and told Marissa we were calling the police. Before I could dial, the app opened by itself. A live view from the driveway camera filled the screen. The image looked normal except for a white band across the top. It was not glare. The band had a curved lower edge and it covered the sky above the neighboring roofs. I tilted the phone. The band stayed in the same place on the feed. On the actual street outside, the white glow had become brighter. Marissa saw it through the window. "What is that?" she asked. I said I didn't know. The phone screen flickered. For one frame, a dark shape appeared beneath the white band. It was tall and narrow, standing on the roof of our garage. Then the image returned to normal. I looked through the living room window toward the garage. The roof was empty. I went to the laundry room and opened the door into the garage. The overhead light came on slowly, taking several seconds to reach full brightness. Both cars were where they should have been. The garage door was shut. Tools hung on the wall. Nothing appeared disturbed. A tapping sound came from above the garage ceiling. It moved from left to right. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. The garage door opener clicked. The small light on the motor flashed once. The door lifted about 2 inches. Cold air pushed across the floor. I hit the wall button. The door stopped but did not close. Through the gap, I could see a strip of driveway and the dark street beyond. Something pale passed across the opening. It did not look like feet. It looked like a smooth length of material, gray-white, and close to the ground. The strip moved from one side of the garage to the other and disappeared. The door lowered by itself. The app sent 4 more alerts. 1:28:3. All sensors, 11 seconds. This time, the motion lights outside came on. Every one of them. The porch light, driveway floodlight, backlight, and side light lit at once. They stayed on while the app counted down. Marissa was standing in the doorway behind me. The garage light dimmed. The low hum started again. I felt it through the concrete floor. The metal shelves vibrated softly. A jar of screws rattled against the workbench. At exactly 11 seconds, the outdoor lights went off. The hum stopped. The garage door opener displayed 117. My phone showed 128. Marissa checked her phone. It showed 117 too. She unlocked it, and the time changed to 128. We called the police. The call connected, but I heard only static. Then a recording said the number was no longer in service. I hung up and tried again. This time a dispatcher answered normally. I said we had heard someone on the roof and that our security system kept triggering. I avoided mentioning the light because I already felt foolish. The dispatcher said an officer would check the area. While we waited, we stayed in the kitchen with every light on. The roof noises stopped. The white glow outside faded. I kept watching the security feeds. For several minutes, nothing triggered. Then the back camera lost color. The live image turned gray. A dark patch appeared on the patio. It was oval and very faint, directly beneath the kitchen window. I looked through the glass. The patio was empty. On the phone, the patch grew darker. Something stood at the edge of it. I could not make out a clear body. It looked like a vertical distortion, about 6 feet tall, bending the fence lines behind it. The shape moved closer to the camera. The image blurred around it. Marissa asked what I was looking at. Before I answered, someone knocked on the front door. 3 soft knocks. We both froze. The police had not arrived. There were no headlights outside. The security app showed no porch motion. Another 3 knocks came. I opened the porch feed. The steps were empty. A voice came through the door. "Mr. Mercer?" It sounded like a man speaking quietly. I asked who it was. There was a pause. "Fort Collins Police." I looked through the small side window. No one stood on the porch. The voice said, "We need you to come outside." Marissa grabbed my arm. I asked for the officer's name. No answer. The door handle moved downward. It stopped against the lock. Then the same voice came through the security camera speaker on my phone. "We need you to come outside." The porch feed still showed no one there. Headlights turned onto our street. A patrol car came around the corner. The voice stopped. The door handle rose back into place. 2 officers got out of the car. One approached the porch while the other shone a flashlight across the side yard. I checked the live camera. Now the first officer appeared clearly. I opened the door after he knocked. His name was Officer Brennan. His partner was Officer Elise Park. I explained the roof sounds and the sensors. Brennan checked the exterior while Park stayed with us. She looked through the motion logs on my phone. She agreed that 4 sensors activating at the exact same time was unusual, but said the system might have reset or lost connection. I showed her the clips. The breathing sound on the driveway recording was gone. The low hum on the back camera was gone too. All 4 clips were silent. The shadow on the side fence remained. Park watched it twice. She asked whether there was a flagpole or overhead cable nearby. There wasn't. Officer Brennan came back and said he found no footprints around the house. That included the roof. There was still a thin layer of snow on the shingles. From the ground, he could see no marks, no disturbed patches, and no broken branches. He checked the attic with me. We used a ladder and pushed the panel open. The attic smelled damp and metallic. The insulation looked undisturbed, no animal tracks, no droppings, no damaged vents. Above the guest room, one section of insulation was wet. It formed a clean oval about 4 feet long. The roof decking above it was dry. Brennan touched the wet area with a gloved hand. He said it felt warm. Then all 4 outdoor motion sensors triggered again. His radio gave a burst of static. The attic went dark. My flashlight still worked, but the overhead hall light below us had gone out. A pale glow appeared through the attic vent at the far end. Brennan looked toward it. The vent faced the back of the house. The glow came through in a wide, soft band. Something moved across it. A narrow shadow passed between the vent slats, then another, then a third. Brennan climbed down first. We all went outside through the front door. The entire street was lit by a faint white glow above the rooftops. Several neighbors had come out. My next-door neighbor, Tom Velasquez, stood in his driveway wearing slippers and a winter coat. He said every light in his house had flashed on at once. A woman farther down the street said her baby monitor had stopped working for 11 seconds. Officer Park looked up. The white glow drifted slowly above the houses. It did not hit her edge. At times it looked oval. At other times it seemed like a flat patch of bright cloud, though the sky around it was clear. No one spoke. The glow moved toward the open land behind our subdivision. As it passed, every motion light along the backs of the houses came on in sequence. Ours, Tom's, the next house, then the next. A line of white lights followed it down the block. The object, or light, rose slightly. For a moment, I saw a darker shape inside it. It looked broad and shallow, with 3 narrow shadows hanging beneath. Then the glow faded. The motion lights went out. Officer Park checked her watch. She said the whole thing had lasted 11 seconds. The officers stayed another half hour. They took a report, but had no explanation. Brennan said they had received 2 other calls about lights and electrical problems from streets nearby. Marissa and I did not sleep. At sunrise, I climbed onto the garage roof with Tom holding the ladder. The snow was smooth except for one area near the ridge. There was a perfect oval where the frost had melted. No footprints led to it. In the center were 3 shallow dents in the shingles, each about the size of a quarter. I took pictures and went back inside. The security system had saved one final clip at 1:41. It came from the driveway camera. The footage showed Officer Brennan and Officer Park standing with us in the street, all looking up at the white glow. The clip lasted 11 seconds. During the last second, the image brightened. A thin, pale figure stood on the garage roof behind us. It faced the camera. There was nothing clear where its face should have been. Then the clip ended. That afternoon, I replaced every outdoor sensor and added 2 cameras aimed at the roof. The new system worked normally for 6 days. On the 7th night, all 6 sensors activated at the same time. The recording lasted exactly 11 seconds. The roof cameras showed nothing. At the end of both clips, a soft voice came through the microphones. It used Marissa's voice. It said my name from directly above the house. I first noticed the birds avoiding South Fork Meadow on a Monday morning while I was clearing storm branches from the trail. My name is Leah Moreno, and I worked as a ranger at Canaan Ridge State Park in eastern Pennsylvania. It was not one of the huge national parks people plan vacations around. It was mostly wooded hills, a narrow lake, 3 camp loops, and a lot of local hikers who brought dogs, even though the sign said not to. I had been there 6 years, long enough to know which creek crossings washed out first and which picnic tables teenagers used when they thought nobody checked after dark. South Fork Meadow sat about 2 miles from the main ranger station, past the old quarry trail and down through a strip of hemlock. It was not big, maybe 4 acres, but it opened suddenly out of thick woods and always felt larger than it was. In late spring, it filled with grass up to your knees, milkweed, black-eyed Susans, ticks, and more birds than anywhere else in the park. That week was warm and wet. It had rained hard Sunday night, and by Monday morning, the whole place steamed when the sun hit it. I had a chainsaw in the back of the utility cart, orange cones, a radio that worked when it felt like it, and a clipboard with 3 small trail issues that turned into 9 before lunch. The first odd thing happened around 8:20. I was cutting a fallen limb from a maple near the meadow entrance when a flock of starlings came over the trees from the west. There were maybe 40 of them, all moving fast and messy the way starlings do. They crossed above the trail, reached the edge of the meadow, and then split. Not turned, split. The flock separated into 2 clean groups, one sweeping left around the meadow, the other right, like water going around a rock. They rejoined on the far side and kept flying east. I shut off the saw and watched them go. It was strange enough that I stood there for a while, helmet still on, listening to the saw tick as it cooled. Birds avoid hawks, smoke, loud equipment, all kinds of things. But there was no hawk I could see, no smoke, no noise except me. and they had avoided the center of the meadow before they ever reached me. I walked out into the grass. The meadow looked normal. Wet seed heads brushed my work pants. Gnats floated in small clouds. The tree line dripped from the rain. A few white butterflies moved low over the flowers. Nothing smelled wrong. No dead animal, no chemical spill, no broken power line. The grass in the center was slightly flattened from the storm, but that was all. I went back to work and didn't think too much about it. By Wednesday, I was thinking about it. Every day, birds refused to cross that meadow. I saw crows come down from the north, hit the invisible boundary over the grass, and climb sharply like they had flown toward glass. I watched 2 turkey vultures circle above the ridge, drift toward South Fork, and then slide around the meadow in a wide, lazy arc without ever entering the air over it. Swallows skimmed low along the trail and snapped upward at the edge, veering off into the trees. It was not just one species. That was what made it harder to ignore. On Wednesday afternoon, I brought it up to Marcus Bell, the other ranger here on duty. He was older than me, retired military, calm in a way that sometimes came across as bored. We were restocking maps at the visitor center desk, and I said, "Have you noticed birds acting weird around South Fork?" He looked up from the map drawer. "Weird how? They won't fly over it." He stared at me for a second, then went back to stacking maps. "Maybe there's a nesting hawk." I looked better. That was Marcus. Not rude exactly, just allergic to mystery. So I looked better. Thursday morning, I hiked in with binoculars instead of taking the cart. The air was cooler then, cloudy and still, with fog caught low between the tree trunks. South Fork Meadow was gray-green in the morning light. The grass held beads of water. The far tree line looked soft through mist. I stood at the edge and watched for 40 minutes. No birds entered the air above the meadow. One was lost. They were everywhere else. Chickadees in the hemlocks behind me, woodpeckers knocking on dead trees, a red-tailed hawk far over the ridge, sparrows low in the brush. But the open space above the meadow stayed empty from ground level to as high as I could see. The silence there was different too. Not total silence, not then. Bugs still clicked in the grass, water dripped, leaves moved a little, but the bird song stopped at the meadow edge. It was like someone had drawn a circle that sound didn't want to cross. I walked to the center. Nothing happened at first. My boots soaked through because the grass was wetter than I expected. I kept looking up, feeling stupid because I was trying to notice an absence. The sky above me was pale and blank with cloud. No glow, no object, no swirling leaves or anything dramatic. Then my radio crackled. It was clipped to my shoulder. Usually, if reception got bad, it gave a hiss or someone's voice chopped in and out. This was 3 short clicks. Click, click, click. I stopped walking. The radio clicked again. 3 times. I pressed the talk button. Ranger 2 to base. Radio check. Static. I tried again. Static, then a low tone under it, not loud. More felt through the radio case against my shoulder than heard. It made my ear ache. I turned in place, holding the radio up. The signal usually improved if I faced the ridge. It didn't. The tone continued for maybe 10 seconds, then cut off. A bird called from the tree line. Only once. The sound was sharp and strained, and then nothing answered it. I looked down and noticed the ground under me was dry. That wasn't possible. Everything around my boots was wet. Grass outside the center area bent heavy with rainwater, and my pant legs were soaked from walking through it. But in a patch around me, maybe 15 feet across, the grass was dry and upright. No droplets, no mud. The soil between the stems looked dusty. I crouched and touched it, warm. The rest of the meadow was cool and damp. The center patch held a steady warmth, like a porch step that had been in sun all afternoon. There had been no sun that morning. I stood up too quickly and felt a little dizzy. That was when I heard wings. A single crow came out of the fog above the west trees, flying low and fast. It headed straight toward me. I had time to think it was finally crossing the meadow, finally proving I had been making patterns out of nothing. At the edge of the dry patch, it dropped. Not like it was shot, not dead. It simply lost lift. Its wings kept moving, but its body dipped hard, almost touching the grass. It twisted sideways, flapped wildly, and managed to veer away toward the south tree line. Once it cleared the meadow, it rose again and disappeared into the fog. I left after that. I told myself I was going back for better equipment, but really I wanted coffee, other people, and a building with lights. That afternoon, I checked old maintenance records. South Fork Meadow had never been treated with herbicide beyond the trail edges. No underground utilities, no buried tanks, no known sinkholes. There had been an old farm there before the park bought the land, but that was true of half the park. At closing, Marcus found me staring at the map. "You still on the bird thing?" he asked. "There's a dry, warm patch in the center." He frowned. "How warm?" "Warm enough to notice." "Could be a deer bed?" 15 feet wide?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I'll walk it with you tomorrow." But he didn't get the chance because Friday evening was when the glow happened. I was supposed to be off at 6, but a family from Camp Loop B got turned around on Pine Hollow Trail, and I stayed late helping guide them back by radio. By the time they reached their car, the sky had gone orange behind the ridge, and a cool dampness had started rising from the creek bottoms. Marcus had already gone home. The seasonal aide Priya was locking the visitor center. I was the last ranger still driving the utility cart. I should have gone straight to the station. Instead, I took the long way past South Fork Meadow. I told myself it was because Marcus wanted to see it tomorrow, and I wanted to know if the dry patch was still there. The real reason was that I had spent 4 days trying not to be afraid of a quiet meadow, and I was irritated with myself. The trail was muddy and dark under the hemlocks. The cart headlights bounced over roots and puddles. Mosquitoes hit my face. My radio sat in the cup holder because the shoulder clip had snapped earlier in the day. I parked at the meadow entrance at 7:43. I remember the time because I looked at my phone before getting out. 1 bar of service, battery at 38%. The sun was down behind the trees, but the sky still held some light. The meadow was a flat, dark green with mist beginning to gather low over the grass. No birds. At that hour, they should have been noisy. Evening calls, wing beats, movement in the brush. The woods behind me had sound, but the meadow itself held quiet like a bowl. I walked in about 20 yards and stopped. The dry patch was visible now, not because the grass looked dry, but because mist avoided it. Low fog crept over the rest of the meadow, thin and white, but the center remained clear. A perfect round area, maybe 20 feet across, with fog curling around its edge. My radio clicked in the cart. 3 clicks. I turned back. The cart headlights flickered once, then steadied. The radio clicked again. The sound carried across the grass too clearly. Then my phone switched to airplane mode. I had it in my hand because I had meant to take a picture. I watched the icon appear at the top of the screen. No signal, no Wi-Fi. I tapped it off. It turned itself back on. I said no, out loud. The word fell flat. It didn't echo or carry into the trees. It sounded like I had spoken into a pillow. A low vibration began under my boots. It was subtle at first, like a large truck idling far away. But there were no roads close enough for that, and the sound didn't come through the air. It came up through the ground. The tall grass around my legs trembled without bending. I stepped backward. The vibration weakened. I stepped forward. It strengthened. That should have been enough. I knew that even then. But I stood there watching the fog curl around the center of the meadow, my phone useless in my hand, because some part of me needed to see what came next. The glow rose from the center at 7:47. It didn't burst up. It didn't beam down from the sky. It rose slowly from the dry patch, a soft white oval forming just above the grass. At first I thought it was fog catching light from the cart headlights, but it wasn't in their beam, and it was too clean. It lifted until it hovered maybe waist-high over the meadow center. It was silent. It did not light the grass below it. That was one of the things I kept coming back to later. A white glow that visible should have cast light. The stems under it should have brightened. My boots should have shone. The trees should have caught some reflection. None of that happened. The glow was visible, but the world around it stayed dim. The low vibration deepened. The fog around the patch pulled back, not blown back, pulled. It retreated in a smooth ring, leaving more dry grass visible. The glow rose higher to about the height of a person, then stopped. It had no features, no hard edge, no source, just a dull, white oval hanging in the air, steady and quiet. A bird hit the invisible boundary above it. I didn't see where it came from. A small, dark shape dropped into view from the north, maybe a swallow or bat, though it was hard to tell in the fading light. It crossed over the meadow edge, then jerked sideways midair as if pushed by a hand. It recovered and fled into the trees. The glow tilted, only slightly. The radio in the cart turned on by itself. Static filled the meadow. Under it was my own voice, or something close to it, saying, "Ranger 2 to base, radio check." That was what I had said the day before. The glow rose another foot. My phone screen went black, then came back showing the camera app. I had not opened it. The image on the screen was brighter than the actual meadow, washed in a gray tone. On the screen, the glow wasn't a featureless oval. It had 3 darker points inside it, arranged in a triangle. I looked up from the phone. With my eyes, I could see only the white oval. I looked back down. The 3 points had moved farther apart. Something snapped in the woods behind me. I turned. At the meadow edge, just beyond the cart headlights, stood a line of deer. 6 of them. Maybe 7. They were shoulder to shoulder along the tree line, all facing outward away from the meadow, not looking at the glow. Their ears were stiff. Their bodies were still. They made no sound. Then every deer took 1 step backward into the trees at the same time. My radio clicked again. 3 clicks. The cart headlights dimmed. The glow in the meadow held steady. I backed toward the cart without taking my eyes off it. The grass seemed to drag at my boots. My legs felt heavy, as if I was walking through shallow water. The vibration under the ground followed each step, rising when I paused, fading when I moved. I reached the cart and grabbed the radio. The screen showed no channel number, just 417 blinking where the channel should have been. I pressed the talk button. "Base, this is Ranger 2. Nothing. I tried again. "Priya, are you still there?" Static. Then Priya's voice came through, very faint. "Leah?" Relief hit me so hard I almost sat down. "I'm at South Fork. I need you to..." The radio cut over her with a low tone. Then a second voice spoke from the speaker. "Mine. Don't stand in the meadow." I dropped the radio onto the seat. The glow moved. It did not drift upward or sideways like mist. It slid forward across the meadow, maybe 6 feet, with the fog bending around it. The dry patch moved with it, grass losing moisture in a widening oval beneath it as it passed. I could see the damp meadow turning pale and dry in its wake. I got in the cart. The key would not turn. I twisted harder. The plastic key tag bit into my palm. Nothing. The dashboard stayed dead. The headlights remained on, weak and yellow. The radio lay on the seat, still hissing. The glow was closer. Not close. Still maybe 40 yards away. But closer than before, and every part of my body knew it. The windshield of the utility cart fogged from the outside. 3 clear circles appeared in the fogged plastic near the center. I got out and ran. I ran toward the trail, not the station, just away from the meadow. My boots slipped in mud, branches slapped my arms. The low vibration stayed behind me at first, then seemed to move under the trail, following through the roots. The woods were wrong in the dusk. The hemlocks were too close. The trail bent where I didn't remember it bending. I had walked that path hundreds of times, but for a few seconds, none of the trees looked familiar. The air warmed around my face, then cooled sharply, then warmed again. Behind me, the cart horn sounded. It did not have a horn. The sound was low and flat, more like a foghorn heard from far away. It lasted several seconds, then cut off. I kept running until the trail opened by the old quarry overlook. There, my phone buzzed in my hand. The screen lit up, 7:47. Still 7:47. I had left the meadow at 7:47. I had run for at least 3 minutes, maybe more. The time had not changed. The phone showed an incoming call from the ranger station. I answered. At first, there was only breathing. Then Marcus said, "Leah?" I almost cried because Marcus had gone home hours ago. "Marcus, where are you?" A pause. "Leah, why is your cart moving?" I stopped walking. "What?" "I'm watching it on the yard cam. It just came up the service road." "That's not possible. I left it at South Fork." The line crackled. His voice came back lower, stretched strangely. "It's empty." Then the call ended. Airplane mode was still on. I stood at the quarry overlook with the dark pit to one side and trees pressed close on the other, trying to decide whether to go toward the station or back to the cart. There was no good choice. The station was still over a mile away on foot. My radio was in the cart. My phone was useless. It was getting dark. A light appeared between the trees behind me. Soft white, low, silent. I did not wait to see if it was the same glow. I ran. The trail from the quarry to the station was wider, gravel in places, easier underfoot. I took it too fast, half stumbling downhill. The woods had sound again in patches. Frogs starting up near the drainage ditch, crickets clicking, leaves moving. Every time the sound returned, I felt like I had crossed some invisible border back into the real world. Then it would cut out again. Silence would drop for 10 seconds. The low vibration would come up through the gravel. The white light would show faintly behind me through trunks. Then sound would return, and I would keep running. I reached the maintenance yard at 8:16 according to the clock over the office door. My utility cart was parked beside the fuel shed. Headlights off, key in the ignition, radio clipped back onto the dash mount where it belonged. Mud on the tires, empty seat. Priya stood on the visitor center porch holding a flashlight. Marcus's truck was beside hers, engine running, driver's door open. He had come back after seeing the cart on the camera. Both of them stared at me like they couldn't decide whether to be relieved or afraid. "Where were you?" Priya asked. "South Fork." Marcus shook his head. The cart came in at 7:49. I looked at the office clock again. 8:17. "That's not possible." He didn't argue. That was when I noticed the birds. The maintenance yard light attracted moths, and usually bats worked the air above it in loops. Swallows nested under the eaves in summer and sometimes still crossed the yard at dusk. That night, every bird sound came from outside the yard. None flew over it. They crossed behind the trees, over the roof lines, along the road, but not above us. Marcus followed my gaze. "Yeah," he said quietly. "They started doing that after the cart rolled in. We checked the cart because we needed something physical to do. The engine was cool. The seat was damp with dew except for 3 dry circles arranged in a triangle. The windshield had 3 clear marks in the fogged plastic. The radio worked normally again, channel number back where it should be." Priya pulled security footage from the yard camera. It showed the service road at 7:49, nearly dark, trees on both sides. The utility cart came into view slowly, headlights on, no driver. It followed the road smoothly, turned into the yard, and parked beside the fuel shed. At least that was what it looked like at first. When Marcus replayed it frame by frame, there was one white frame just before the cart entered the yard. Pure white. Then, the cart appeared. In the white frame, if the monitor was tilted back and the room lights were off, 3 dark marks could be seen near the center, arranged in a triangle. We did not file an incident report that night. Marcus said we would write up an equipment issue in the morning. Priya said nothing. I sat in the break room drinking water from a paper cup and trying to stop my hands shaking. The next morning, the park manager, Denise Harlan, walked South Fork Meadow with all 3 of us. The place looked normal in sunlight, except for the center. The grass had dried in a long oval path from the middle of the meadow toward the trail where the cart had been parked. It was not burned. It was not flattened by tires. It was simply dry, pale, and warm to the touch, while the surrounding meadow was damp with morning dew. At the original center point were 3 holes in the soil, narrow, clean, about the width of a pencil, arranged in a triangle. Denise poked one with a marking flag. The metal rod slid down all the way to the plastic tab and stopped without hitting rock. She pulled it out fast. Marcus looked up at the sky. Birds crossed above the tree line in both directions, crossed the meadow. Denise closed the trail for habitat assessment. That was the wording on the temporary sign. Visitors complained for about a week, then found other loops to walk. We put up orange fencing around the meadow entrance, and Marcus installed a camera on a tree facing the center. For the next 3 days, the camera recorded nothing unusual. On the 4th day, all footage from 7:47 to 8:17 was missing. Not black. Missing. The file jumped from a still, sunny meadow to a dark one half an hour later. The camera 50 yards down the trail recorded hikers passing, squirrels, a raccoon, normal light change. Nothing else. I left Canaan Ridge at the end of the season and took a job with county parks closer to town. On my last day, I walked past South Fork alone before turning in my keys. The fencing was still up. The grass had grown back mostly normal, though the oval path remained a slightly different color. Birds moved in the trees around it, loud and busy. A hawk circled high above the ridge. When it reached the air above the meadow, it turned, wide and smooth, without crossing. I was driving through the Flint Hills with the windows down because the truck smelled like old coffee and damp work gloves, and I had about an hour of road left before I got home. It was late afternoon in early April, one of those Kansas days that looked warm until the wind hit your arm. The sky was clear except for a few thin clouds way off to the south, and the sun sat low behind my left shoulder, bright enough that I had to keep the visor down. Everything around me was brown-green, the grass just starting to come back after winter, with long, smooth hills rolling away from the road in every direction. My name is Nora DeWitt. I was 39 then, and I worked for a farm insurance company out of Emporia. That day I had been out near Council Grove looking at storm damage on a metal barn. Nothing dramatic, just bent panels and a tree limb through a machine shed roof. I took photos, filled out forms, talked with the owner, a man named Ruben Salas, who told me 3 different times that the wind came sideways. Then I headed back on a county road because I hated taking the same route twice in one day. The road was empty. Not empty like lonely, just normal, rural empty. Barbed wire fences, cattle ponds, a few black cows on hillsides, old limestone posts leaning along the road. Every few miles, there was a ranch gate or a gravel drive with a mailbox. The radio came in and out, so I had turned it off. I was listening to the tires and the wind, and that little rattle behind the dashboard I had been ignoring for months. I noticed the shadows because they were so long. The sun was dropping to the west, so every fence post and cedar tree threw a shadow east across the grass. The hills had that late-day look where one side was gold and the other side was dull and gray. It was pretty enough that I actually thought about pulling over for a picture, but I was hungry and wanted to get home before dark. A few minutes after I passed a cattle guard with a faded sign that said "Private road, no trespassing," the first odd thing happened. The shadow of my truck moved. Not the truck. The shadow. It had been running out to the right, a stretched dark shape along the road's shoulder and grass. For maybe 1 second, it slid forward ahead of me, like the light source had shifted behind the truck. Then it snapped back to the right. I looked in the mirror because my first thought was that another vehicle had come up behind me with bright headlights, even though it was broad daylight. There was nothing. Empty road curving back between the hills. I kept driving, but I turned the radio on out of habit. Static. I tried 2 stations, got a burst of country music, then static again, then a low clicking sound that didn't sound like radio at all. I turned it off. The clicking kept going for 3 seconds after the knob shut it down. I stared at the radio, then the temperature display on the dash changed from 54 to 88. It held there for maybe 5 seconds, then dropped back to 53. I remember laughing once, a nervous little sound, and saying, "Nope, not today," like the truck could hear me. It was an old Tacoma with almost 190,000 miles on it. Weird electrical things weren't impossible. I had one window that only worked when it felt like it. The road climbed a slow hill. At the top, the land opened wider. There were no trees there, just pasture, fence, and a few cattle scattered across a slope. The sun was still where it had been, low in the west, shining through my driver's side window. Then every shadow on the land shifted direction, all at once. The fence post shadows, the cattle shadows, the long dark lines from the road signs, even the shallow shadows in the grass. Everything turned. For a few seconds, they pointed north instead of east. It wasn't gradual. It was like someone had picked up the light and moved it 90 degrees while leaving the sun exactly where it was. I hit the brake. The truck slowed hard, gravel popping under the tires as I pulled halfway onto the shoulder. I looked straight at the sun through the windshield edge and the visor. It was still in the west. Same place. Same brightness. But the shadows on the hills pointed the wrong way. Then they shifted back. The whole landscape corrected itself in one smooth motion, shadows sliding over grass and fence wire until they lined up where they belonged again. I sat there with both hands on the wheel and the engine idling. Nothing moved except the wind through the grass. A cow on the hillside lifted its head and stared across the road, not at me, but at something beyond the ditch. The other cows did the same, one after another, all turning their heads toward the same empty spot. I looked where they were looking. There was nothing there, just a shallow swale between 2 hills, a fence line, and a dry creek bed full of pale stones. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. I picked it up, expecting a work email or my sister asking if I could stop by the store. The screen had gone black. When it came back on, airplane mode was on. I tapped it off. It turned itself back on. The time said 5:17. I had left the Salas place at 4:38. The drive to that point should have taken closer to an hour. Maybe I was misremembering. Maybe the job had ended later than I thought. I opened the recent photos from the barn inspection to check their timestamps, but the phone froze on a picture of the bent metal roof. Then the photo changed. Not completely. The barn was still there, Reuben's red pickup still in the background, clouds still reflected in the puddle by the door. But a shadow lay across the gravel yard in the picture that I did not remember. A long oval shadow, dark and soft-edged, covering the corner of the barn and part of Reuben's truck. I had taken that picture in full sun. There had been nothing overhead. The phone screen went black again. A low vibration started under the truck. At first, I thought the engine had begun to misfire. I put it in park and gave it a little gas. The engine revved normally, but the vibration didn't change. It came from below the road, through the tires, through the seat. It was steady and deep, like heavy machinery running underground. I opened the door. The wind cut in, cold against my face. Outside, the sound was easier to feel than here. The grass along the shoulder trembled, but not from wind. The seed heads shook in tiny, tight movements, while the taller grass around them leaned in the regular breeze. I stepped down onto the road. The pavement was warm. That made no sense. The air was cool and the sun was low, and the road should have held some heat, sure, but not like that. It felt warm through the sole of my boot, almost like a heated floor. I crouched and put my palm on the asphalt. Warm, but only in one place. A round patch maybe 6 feet across, centered near my front tires. Outside that patch, the pavement was normal cool. Inside it, the warmth was steady and even. I stood up quickly. The cattle were still facing the swale. The shadows shifted again. This time I watched it happen from outside the truck. All the shadows in the pasture turned south, sliding over the hills like dark cloth. The sun did not move. I could see it in the corner of my eye, bright and fixed over the west ridge. My own shadow, which should have stretched across the road to the east, swung around and pointed toward the ditch. For 3 seconds, I had 2 shadows, one faint where it should have been, one darker, pointing the wrong way. Then the wrong one vanished, and the real one deepened. I backed toward the truck. Something flashed in the swale. Not a bright flash. More like a dull, white reflection, low to the ground, partly hidden by the rise. It was smooth and wide, visible for only a moment between the grass and the limestone fence posts. I thought of a silver stock tank, but I knew there wasn't one there because I had looked at that exact patch a second before. Then the cattle moved, not running, not panicked. They stepped backward in unison, all of them, hooves placing carefully in the grass, heads still pointed toward the swale. 8 or 9 black cows moving at the same time without making a sound. I had been around livestock enough to know that wasn't normal. The truck door chime started. Ding, ding, ding. I had left the door open, so that was normal, but then the sound slowed down, each ding stretching too long, dropping in pitch until it sounded less like a warning chime and more like a bell underwater. I got back in and shut the door. The chime stopped. The dashboard clock still said 5:17. I put the truck in drive and pulled away. I didn't peel out. I was too afraid of losing control on gravel and ending up in the ditch. I just drove, steady and stiff, trying not to look at the swale. The road dipped after the hill, then rose again. I expected the strange patch to disappear behind me. Instead, the shadows ahead began to misbehave in smaller ways. The shadow of a road sign pointed one way, then split into 2 for half a second. The shadow of a cedar tree climbed uphill against the grass, then dropped back. Fence shadows trembled like they were reflections on water. The low vibration followed under the road. I tried calling my sister, Eliza. Airplane mode was still on, but the call screen opened anyway. It rang once through the truck speakers, even though the radio was off. "Eliza?" I said. No answer. Only the vibration, clearer through the speakers now, with a faint tapping under it. Tap, tap, tap. Then Eliza's voice came through, quiet and flat. "Nora, where are you standing?" "I'm driving." A pause. "Where are you standing?" "Eliza, can you hear me?" Another pause, longer this time. "Don't let the second shadow touch you." The call ended. I stared at the phone, then back at the road. Airplane mode was still on. The call log later showed nothing, but at that moment the call duration displayed a 4 for 17 and would not change. The shadows shifted a third time. I saw it coming this time because the light on the hills changed first. The grass lost its gold color and became gray, though the sun still burned orange in the west. A darker light seemed to rise from the north, not visible as a source, just present in the shadows it made. Every object cast a second shadow. Fence posts, cattle, weeds, the truck hood, even the little crack in the windshield had a doubled line. The second shadows pointed toward the road from both sides, long and thin, all converging ahead of me. I slowed without meaning to. The road in front of me looked darker where the second shadows met. Not blocked, not wet. Darker, like the pavement was a hole painted to look like road. The truck rolled toward it, and the steering wheel tugged slightly left, then right.